The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency William Samoei Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya and Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Forces. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Madam President, the President of the 80th session of the UN General Assembly, Madam Annalena Baerbock, Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I congratulate you, Madam President, on your election to preside over the 80th session of the UN General Assembly. Madam President, you can count on Kenya's full support throughout your tenure as you steer the Assembly into the future. Ladies and gentlemen, 8 years ago, in the aftermath of the unprecedented global destruction and devastating war, the international community came together in hope. They created this organization, the United Nations, as a shield against the horrors of war, as a platform for dialogue, and as a bridge to a better, fairer, more secure global community. What is often forgotten or not mentioned today is that the United Nations grew out of the failure of the League of Nations that existed between 1919 and 1945. The League of Nations did not collapse for lack of good intentions or noble objectives. Formed at the end of the First World War and as part of the Treaty of Versailles, it was humanity's first attempt to build a permanent international organization to stop aggression and war and bring nations together. Its ambitions were to achieve collective global security, disarmament, peaceful dispute resolution, and cooperation on humanitarian and social issues. Despite these ideals, the League of Nations failed. The United States never joined, other great powers came and went, and without enforcement authority, its condemnation carried little weight. When Japan invaded Manchuria, when Italy marched into Ethiopia, and when Hitler openly defied its rules, the League stood by, helpless and powerless. By the late 1930s, its credibility had collapsed, and with the outbreak of the World War II, it was rendered irrelevant. Madam President, this history is both a lesson and a warning. Institutions rarely fail because they lack vision or ideals. More often, they drift into irrelevance when they do not adapt, when they hesitate to act, and when they lose legitimacy. To remain relevant, institutions must be reimagined, must be reformed, renewed, and aligned with emerging realities. 8 decades ago, the founders of the UN sought to correct the failures of the League of Nations by creating a stronger, more inclusive organization anchored in the principles of, and I quote, "We the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war," end of quote. Today, we are gathered for the UN at 80. The question is unavoidable. Is the United Nations relevant to the demands of our time? Can it continue to serve humanity in the face of current realities? Or has it become a relic of a bygone era? Madam President, Excellencies, we meet against a grim global backdrop. Conflict rages in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and beyond. Climate disasters grow fiercer by the day. inequality deepens, pandemics loom, and technological disruptions outpaces governance. Instead of trust, mistrust is spreading. Instead of solidarity, fragmentation is taking root. In place of hope, anxiety fills our global community. We are living, to borrow from the words of the founders of this institution, not in larger freedom, but in growing uncertainty. At this moment of turbulence, when we most need a strong United Nations, the organization faces its deepest crisis in credibility and capacity. Funding cuts have paralyzed its operations. Bureaucracy has slowed its response. The Security Council remains frozen in the post-war structures of 1945, unable to act inclusively, with fairness, and with speed. Ladies and gentlemen, I can, however, state with absolute conviction that the United Nations has been one of humanity's greatest achievements. For 8 decades, it has held back the specter of global war, calmed conflicts from Cambodia to Liberia, and stood guard in some of the world's most dangerous places through the courage of its peacemakers and peacekeepers. Few institutions in humanity's history can claim such a legacy. The United Nations has stood at the front lines of humanitarian crisis, from famine relief in the Horn of Africa to emergency shelter for millions of Syrian and Ukrainian refugees. It was at the forefront in the eradication of smallpox, coordinated global responses to HIV and AIDS, Ebola, and COVID-19, and continues to champion universal vaccination. Its agencies have advanced women's rights, protected children, safeguarded refugees, and set global norms on everything from disarmament to climate action. The UN Sustainable Development Goals remain a shared blueprint for human progress. These are achievements no nation could have achieved alone, however rich, however great, or however powerful. And yet, every institution, no matter how noble its origins or impactful its legacy, must adapt to changing times or slide into irrelevance. Today, the United Nations stands at a crossroads of renewal on one hand or decay on another. Put differently, after 80 years, the rhymes of time are calling on us to reimagine the original promise that inspired the founding of the United Nations, and that is the quest for global peace, development, and human rights. But this call must now be answered in a global context that is profoundly different from the post-war era in which the UN was conceived then. We would be denying the cold, hard truth if we say that the United Nations is delivering as it should. On peace and security, its voice is too often drowned by the rivalries of great powers, while some nations simply ignore its resolutions and do as they please. Too often, the UN's blue helmet, once a symbol of moral authority, no longer commands the same respect. From the conflicts in Gaza to Ukraine, to the crisis in Sudan, DRC Congo, Somalia, and the Sahel, we see actors proceed undeterred by the United Nations calls. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Kenya speaks from the experience of a nation deeply invested in multilateralism. For decades, we have placed our troops and police in harm's way for peacekeeping missions across Africa and beyond, from Somalia to Democratic Republic of Congo, from South Sudan to most recently in our neighborhood here in Haiti. Over the past 15 months, we are proud to have led the multinational security support mission in Haiti, not because it has been easy, but because solidarity is the essence of the United Nations. Madam President, the mandate of the MSS mission is coming to an end in a few days. As the lead nation, allow me to briefly share our experiences, the successes and the challenges, as both a cautionary tale and a living lesson about the strengths and weaknesses of the current global security governance architecture. For far too long, the people of Haiti called out to the world. Too often, their pleas were met with silence, hesitation, or half measures. Haiti became a tragic reminder of what happens when the international community looks away, prevaricates, or offers half-hearted support. When Kenya responded to the quest for the Haitian authorities, it was in the belief that we were joining a genuinely multinational effort. We welcomed and fully embraced Resolution 2699, by which the United Nations Security Council authorized the MSS with Kenya as the lead nation. Drawing on our decades of peace support operations, we stepped forward, stepped up, and deployed our officers to confront the rampant menace of gang violence in Port-au-Prince and its environs. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, the mission has operated in a volatile environment under enormous constraints. It has been underfunded, under-equipped, and operated below 40% of its authorized personnel strength. Our police officers have valiantly shouldered responsibilities without the full logistical support that would accompany any mission sanctioned by the United Nations. Despite these challenges, and against all odds, the MSS has delivered results many thought were impossible. The presidential palace, once under siege from gangs, is today restored as the seat of government. The police headquarters and the police training center, once overrun by gangs, are now secure, with the academy resuming the training of new police officers, over 700 of whom graduated a few months ago. Schools that have been shattered by violence have reopened, with children back in class, learning and progressing. Roads once manned or blocked by gangs have now free-flowing traffic. Cases of kidnapping and extortion have reduced sharply. The airport and the seaport, once surrounded by gangs, are now abuzz with normal operations. Which begs the question, if so much could be achieved with limited resources and stretched personnel within just 15 months, what more could have been accomplished if the United Nations fraternity had truly acted together in solidarity with the people of Haiti? From this podium, I wish to assure all partners and actors that with the right personnel, adequate resources, appropriate equipment, and necessary logistics, Haiti's security can be restored. Gangs can be neutralized and the safety of streets, schools, hospitals, and homes secured. The continued harassment, abductions, and criminal acts undermining the lives of Haitians are unacceptable, unjustifiable, and must be stopped by this organization, the United Nations. Madam President, as the UN Security Council deliberates on the next steps, we must not lose sight of the fact that the situation in Haiti demands sustained, coordinated, and undivided international attention. A careful and orderly transition from MSS is essential to consolidate the hard-won gains so far achieved. I urge the Security Council and all partners to remain steadfast in ensuring that Haiti moves forward on a path of peace, stability, and renewal. Ladies and gentlemen, on human rights, our principle is clear and unwavering. The protection of civilians and respect for humanitarian law cannot be applied selectively. We cannot condemn suffering in one place and turn a blind eye in another. Kenya, is gravely concerned by the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza and by the immense suffering of civilians caught in the devastation of disproportionate military operations. At the same time, we call for the unconditional release of Israeli hostages. In line with the African Union and United Nations resolutions, we also call for a permanent ceasefire, for strict adherence to international humanitarian law, and for the launch of a credible political process. Only through such a process can the vision of a two-state solution be realized, where Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace, security, and stability. Kenya is equally deeply troubled by the worsening humanitarian situation in Sudan, where innocent citizens are caught in the crossfire of a needless war. We fully endorse the Quad, comprising Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States, in affirming that there cannot be a military solution and that only political dialogue offers a viable path forward. We join the Quad in urging all parties, including SAF, RSF, and the external actors, to respect Sudan's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, and firmly reject any attempts to divide the country, reaffirming our unwavering support for a unified Sudan for the benefit of all its people. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, those who look to the future with a clear vision know that climate change is not only the single greatest threat of our age, but also one of the greatest transformation opportunities of our time. The global stocktake has made it plain that the world is off track. Current national determined contributions are steering us towards temperature rises far beyond any safe threshold. This is the difference between survival on one hand and devastation for millions across the world on the other. Kenya and Africa are not passive victims of this crisis. We are taking bold steps showing that climate action is not only possible, but can also be the foundation for inclusive growth. We are building a climate-resilient society by embedding adaptation into every sector, from agriculture and energy to infrastructure and livelihoods, to sustainable mining and artificial intelligence. This ambition is visible on the ground. Today, 93% of Kenya's electricity comes from renewable sources: geothermal, wind, solar, and hydro. We are expanding investments in e-mobility, climate-smart agriculture, clean cooking solutions, and green manufacturing. We are also pioneering nature-compatible solutions such as sustainable waste management and circular economy interventions. Africa, too, is uniting its voice. In 2023, in Nairobi, we hosted the inaugural Africa Climate Summit, where the continent adopted the Nairobi Declaration on Climate Action and Call to Action. Just 2 weeks ago, in Addis Ababa, Africa came together once more at the second Africa Climate Summit to reaffirm our commitment and strengthen our ambition for climate-positive growth. We declared Africa not just as a victim of the crisis, but as a source of solutions, with climate action driving economic growth, transformation, and job creation for our communities. Ambition, ladies and gentlemen, cannot stand on willpower alone. Implementing our new NDCs will require $56 billion. That is why we call on the global community to unlock the $300 billion agreed at Baku, and to accelerate negotiations towards the new $1.3 trillion goal under the Baku-Belém roadmap. Without affordable finance and without reform of the international financial architecture, the promise of climate action in Africa will remain constrained. Madam President, in the aftermath of World War II, the Bretton Woods institutions were created to stabilize the global economy and rebuild war-torn Europe. At that time, their design reflected the power and interest of the victorious nations, who were also their primary shareholders and beneficiaries. The IMF was tasked with upholding the gold standard exchange rate system, while the World Bank was established to finance Europe's reconstruction. Both have since evolved into development finance institutions, but their structures, decision-making, and governance remains dominated by wealthy nations. Today, the global context is vastly different. The global standard collapsed 5 decades ago, and Europe has long since been rebuilt. Yet, the governance of these institutions has not kept pace with needs of a multipolar world, especially the needs of poor and developing nations. The mismatch between shareholders and stakeholders has become starkly visible. For instance, during the IMF's recent allocation of special drawing rights, 64% went to wealthy nations. Just imagine, 64%. With little need for liquidity support. They didn't need the money anyway, but they got 64%. While the poorer countries received just 2.4%. What a disconnect. The imbalance highlights how the very institutions meant to safeguard global finance stability often perpetuate inequality and instability. I have argued, and I say it again, that the current global financial architecture punishes poor countries with high interest rates and enormous conditionalities, while rewarding rich nations with lower interest rates and softer lending rates. Its rules, priorities, and allocation mechanisms consistently favor those already prosperous, while trapping vulnerable economies in cycles of debt, high borrowing costs, and inadequate access to emergency support and concessional funding. It is imperative to transform these institutions into genuinely independent, apolitical global bodies that their operations are aligned with their global mandate. Such a shift would democratize decision-making, restore credibility, and allow the IMF and the World Bank to serve all countries fairly rather than reinforcing old hierarchies. But Africa is not merely waiting for external prescriptions. We are taking bold and deliberate steps to strengthen our financial independence, safeguard our stability, and accelerate our development. Kenya, for instance, fully endorses the establishment of the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, launched with the Africa Union in February 2024. This alliance brings together our homegrown banks, Afrexim Bank, the Africa Finance Corporation, the Trade and Development Bank, Shelter Africa Re, Africa Development Bank, Africa Trade and Investment Development Insurance, and ZEP-RE, institutions that embody Africa's determination to mobilize resources, finance trade, and build resilience on our own terms. At the same time, the Africa Union is championing 3 transformative institutions: the Africa Central Bank, which will issue a single currency and free our trade from dependence on foreign money; the Africa Monetary Fund, positioned to stabilize our economies and give us true financial sovereignty; and the Africa Investment Bank, designed to mobilize resources for infrastructure, industrialization, and integration that Africa needs to rise. And to complete this vision, the Africa Credit Rating Agency, one that understands our realities, values our uniqueness, and tells our story with fairness and truth, has already been established. Excellencies, as we mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, Africa also marks 20 years since the Ezulwini Consensus and the 60th Declaration, the two historic milestones that establishes the common African position on UN Security Council reforms. For 2 decades, Africa has spoken in one voice, demanding justice, equity, and representation in the highest organ of global governance. This demand, however, continues to be ignored, deferred, or endlessly debated to the detriment of both Africa and the legitimacy of the United Nations itself. You cannot claim to be the United Nations while disregarding the voice of 54 nations. It is not possible. Africa is no longer willing to wait on the margins of global governance while decisions about peace, security, and development are made without our understanding, without our perspectives, and without our voice. Africa's exclusion is not only unacceptable, unfair, and grossly unjust, it also undermines the very credibility of the United Nations, this organization. Africa dominates most of the Security Council agenda, provides some of the largest contingents of UN peacekeeping forces, and bears the heaviest costs of instability. Yet we remain the only continent without a permanent seat at the main table where decisions about our destiny are made. Africa deserves, ladies and gentlemen, at the very least, 2 permanent seats with full rights, including the right to veto, and 2 additional non-permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council. The world must understand that reforming the Security Council is not a favor to Africa or to anybody. It is a necessity for the United Nations' own survival. If the United Nations is to remain relevant in this century, it must reflect today's realities, not the post-war power arrangements of 1945. Madam President, despite the stated and evident weaknesses of the United Nations, it still remains humanity's best chance at global solidarity. No other institution has the universal legitimacy or convening power of the UN. From coordinating humanitarian relief in times of war and disaster, to mobilizing the global response to COVID-19, to driving consensus on climate change through the Paris Agreement, the UN has consistently shown that the world can achieve together what no nation can accomplish on its own, however mighty or great or powerful. As Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN's Second Secretary General, once observed, and I quote, "The United Nations was not created to take humanity to heaven, but to save it from hell." End of quote. That mission is as urgent today as it was 8 decades ago. At a time when conflicts are multiplying, when climate change threatens every economy, and when inequality is widening, the need for a functioning, credible, effective, and a multilateral system has never been greater. It is through the UN that nations have pooled resources to vaccinate billions of children, to protect refugees from through the work of the UNHCR, and to keep the peace in more than 70 missions across the world. Without the UN, these achievements, modest though they may sometimes seem, would not have been possible. That is why we must resist the temptation to give up on the UN or abandon it. We must make it fit for purpose, reform its structures, strengthen its mandate, and ensure its decisions reflect today's realities rather than the geopolitical map of a bygone era. As one of the hosts of the UN headquarters and the only one in the Global South, Kenya stands ready to do its part to enable the organization to go through this phase of renewal successfully as envisaged by the Secretary General under UN 80 reforms. In conclusion, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, the 80th anniversary of the United Nations must be more than a commemoration. It must be a turning point for the organization. Let us seize this moment to reimagine and rebuild the UN into a body that commands legitimacy, responds with speed, and delivers justice for all. I thank you, and God bless you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Kenya and Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Forces.
The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
President of the General Assembly, the Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I congratulate Her Excellency Annalena Baerbock on her election as President of the General Assembly to lead this historic 80th session of the General Assembly. I thank her predecessor, His Excellency Filmo Young, for his distinguished leadership during the 79th session. I commend the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, for his steadfast commitment to the ideas of the United Nations during these increasingly turbulent times. Madam President, it's both an honor and a solemn responsibility to address this Assembly on the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. This Assembly is not just ceremonial. It is a call for the world's conscience to act with unity, determination, and vision. Our theme, Better Together, 80 years and more for peace, development, and human rights, both celebrates and summons. It reminds us that cooperation delivers progress. It also demands that we reimagine multilateralism so that peace, dignity, and equality are not promises on paper, but realities in the lives of people. This anniversary is not a time for complacency, but for courageous renewal. Today, we face deepening inequalities, climate crises, geopolitical fragmentation, technological disruptions, and entrenched conflict. No nation can meet these challenges alone. We need bold multilateralism and a united nations that is not only reformed, but reinvigorated. The UN must be more than a meeting place. It must be a working place for people, for peace, and for our planet. Madam President, Sierra Leone is a small state that has relied heavily on the United Nations chapter and now helps to uphold it. We speak with independence and conviction because we have lived the cost of its absence. I also serve as chair of ECOWAS Authority of Heads of State and Government, and coordinator of the African Union Committee of 10 heads of state and government on Security Council reform, C10. For both myself and the people of Sierra Leone, these roles are not just titles, they are responsibilities. They reflect Sierra Leone's conviction that principled multilateralism is the surest defense of law, equity, and peace. Since 1945, the Charter's promise of sovereign equality, non-aggression, and human dignity have been the bedrock of small states like ours. In 1961, when Sierra Leone first addressed this assembly, our founding Prime Minister, Sir Milton Magai, pledged that our voice would be independent and principled, guided not by bitterness, but by conviction. That pledge remains our compass. We stand for justice and equality. We uphold the right of all people to self-determination. We speak truth. We speak truth to power and act in defense of humanity and the rule of law. Small states are not inherently small. Our sovereignty is equal and our responsibilities are the same. Leadership is not the loudest voice in the room. It is the clearest voice for justice. Madam President, our current term on the UN Security Council has deepened these convictions. Guided by the Charter, we have championed peace through dialogue, upheld international law, and promoted prevention as the first duty of collective security. We have supported efforts to stabilize Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, de-escalated tensions in the Middle East, and supported political transition in Lebanon and Syria for peace and stability. We have also seen the Security Council's limits, its paralysis in the face of grave human suffering. Nowhere has this failure been heart-wrenching than in Gaza. A preventable genocide was not prevented. Mass starvation that could have been avoided was not avoided. A broadly supported two-state solution has been obstructed by division and inaction. We therefore welcome all member states that have recently announced their long overdue recognition of the state of Palestine. Yet, much more remains to be done. We must bring an end to the war and ensure the release of all hostages and prisoners. Sierra Leone has not wavered. We have spoken with independence, voted with principle, and pressed for urgent action to end atrocities and revive hope. We say again, cease fire now in Gaza. Cease fire now in Sudan. Cease fire now in Ukraine. These are not just slogans. They are calls to conscience, calls to action. In fact, they are echoes of the UN's founding pledge to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Its veto should never be a verdict against humanity. Madam President, across the world, the UN's authority and legitimacy are being tested. Selective adherence to international law, disregard for Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, deprivation of funding, attacks on peacekeepers and humanitarian workers, disinformation that corrodes trust, and over-reliance on unilateral action. For countries like Sierra Leone, this is not an abstract debate. We know what a working United Nations means. At our darkest hour, during one of the most brutal civil wars in modern history, the UN stood by our side. The United Nations missions in Sierra Leone, UNAMSI, one of the largest peacekeeping operations of its time, helped disarm over 75,000 combatants, restore civilian governance, support democratic elections. The Special Court for Sierra Leone and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, both backed by the United Nations, ensured justice and reconciliation. When the United Nations Integrated Peacebuilding Office in Sierra Leone closed in 2014, it signaled something rare in our world: a successful transition from war to peace. We saw blue helmets on our streets. We saw ballot papers returned to citizens' hands. We saw our nation breathe again. When the UN works, lives are saved. When it fails, lives are lost. We must ensure the UN delivers for all, and to do so, we must respect and implement UN decisions, protect those who serve under the United Nations flag, invest in prevention and peace building, and reform the Security Council so its authority and legitimacy match today's world. The United Nations cannot protect vulnerable people if it cannot protect its own authority. As a nation, Sierra Leone does its part and contributes troops to peacekeeping missions. We serve as elected Security Council member and offer our experience in peace building to the world. Sierra Leone's story is proof that multilateral solidarity works when it is grounded in trust, mutual respect, and genuine investment in national ownership. Madam President, peace is inseparable from development. In Sierra Leone, our medium-term national development aligned with the SDGs and the African Union's Agenda 2063 prioritizes people-centered growth. We are transforming our agricultural sector to ensure food security. We are investing in a digital economy that fosters inclusion and innovation. We are deepening investment in human capital development through free quality education and in healthcare, particularly maternal and child health. We are expanding renewable energy to support industrialization and climate resilience. Climate change is an existential threat to Sierra Leone. Our greenhouse gas emissions are negligible, yet Our people and our wide coast bears the cost through erosion, flooding, and pressure on food systems and fisheries. We have mainstreamed climate adaptation and strengthened disaster preparedness. In fulfillment of the commitment made at the Third United Nations Oceans Conference, Sierra Leone has ratified the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, BBNG. As the 60th state to deposit its instrument of ratification, Sierra Leone is proud of the collective endeavor to trigger the entry into force of the BBNG Treaty, a historic milestone for multilateralism and the collective stewardship of our ocean commons. We urge all countries to do the same, so the high seas and areas are governed by common good. Climate justice is not charity. It is a legal and moral responsibility. If the poorest are left to pay the highest climate price, there is no justice. Developed nations must honor their commitments, $100 billion per year in climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. We welcome the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on climate change, affirming states' obligation to prevent environmental harm and to protect future generations. In that spirit, Sierra Leone is proud to present the candidature of Professor Dr. Charles Cherno Jallow to the International Court of Justice, a distinguished jurist and tireless advocate for the rule of law. We respectfully solicit the support of all member states in the November 12 elections this year. Madam President, as chair of the ECOWAS Authority of Heads of State and Government, I proudly note our community's 50th anniversary. For 5 decades, ECOWAS has embodied regional integration and collective security, often acting decisively when others hesitated. ECOWAS moved early in Sierra Leone's peace process, before and alongside the UN, to end our civil war. It has done so in Liberia, the Gambia, and elsewhere to defend democracy and stabilize the region. These are African solutions to African challenges, open to global partnerships anchored in regional legitimacy and trust. Partnership with Africa must move from promise to practice. As chair of the ECOWAS Authority, I recently embarked on a regional tour, including a second visit to Burkina Faso in 2 years. This was to demonstrate solidarity and build trust between ECOWAS member states and the Alliance of Sahelian States. I commend the leadership of Burkina Faso for its willingness to engage and I look forward to continued dialogue with the leadership of both Mali and Niger. In my role as chair of the ECOWAS Authority, I have placed emphasis on advancing and safeguarding democratic governance with a strong commitment to upholding constitutional order and reflecting the people's will, countering terrorism and strengthening our regional security architecture, including operationalizing the ECOWAS standby force and implementing counterterrorism strategies. enhancing economic integration by promoting trade, liberalization, developing cross-border infrastructure, and advancing towards a common ECOWAS currency. Strengthening the credibility of institutions through reforms that promote transparency, efficiency, and service focused on citizens. We urge the United Nations to deepen its partnership with ECOWAS and other African regional mechanisms in the spirit of Chapter 8 of the United Nations Charter. Africa is not a problem to be solved. Africa is a partner to be empowered. Madam President, during Sierra Leone's tenure as elected member of the Security Council 2024-2025, we have highlighted the urgent security challenges in West Africa and the Sahel, where terrorism and violent extremism transcends borders and destabilize the entire region. However, Africa's lack of permanent representation continues to hinder the Council's ability to act decisively and contextually. We have advocated for a comprehensive approach to counterterrorism in the Sahel, linking security with development, governance reforms, and regional cooperation, and strengthening the UN-AU-ECOWAS partnership. Too often, however, the Council's response has been hindered by narrow geopolitical interests, delaying action that could have saved lives. Our experience confirms a clear truth. Lasting peace requires inclusivity, ownership, and legitimacy. The Council's structural imbalance undermines its credibility and must be addressed to ensure the safeguarding of collective security. Madam President, in my capacity as coordinator of the African Union Committee of 10 on Security Council reforms, I speak on behalf of a continent still excluded from the permanent representation on the Council. Africa, home to 1.4 billion people and the largest regional bloc in the United Nations, still has no permanent seat. This is unjust and untenable. It undermines the credibility of the Council and the legitimacy of its decisions. The common African position expressed in the Rajoelina Consensus and SAT Declaration calls for at least 2 permanent seats for Africa with full rights and prerogatives, including the veto, if retained, and 2 additional non-permanent seats. This is not a request. It is a demand for equity. It is a test of UN's commitment to fairness and its own charter. During our Security Council presidency in August last year, we gave this issue unprecedented prominence. As we mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations and the 20th anniversary of the Rajoelina Consensus and SAT Declaration, let this be the moment that the international community answers Africa's call. Let us not pass on to the next generation a Security Council reform that fails to reflect the world as it is today. Madam President, the United Nations at 80 must look forward. Sierra Leone stands ready, committed to to principled multilateralism, to speaking with independence and conviction, and to working for justice, solidarity, and the dignity of all peoples. Let this anniversary be a turning point, measured not in the many speeches we make here, but service, not in declarations, but in delivery. Let us build a United Nations more representative, more responsive, and more resilient. The world does not need a louder United Nations. It requires a braver United Nations. Now is the time to make the United Nations work for all. Together, let us forge a future of peace, shared prosperity, and human dignity. For in unity, we are not only better, we are stronger. Thank you.
L'Assemblée va maintenant entendre l'allocution de son Excellence M. Azali Assoumani, président de l'Union des Comores. Je prie le protocole de bien vouloir accompagner son Excellence, que j'invite à prendre la parole devant l'Assemblée.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Excellence, Madame la Présidente de l'Assemblée générale, Excellence, Monsieur le Secrétaire général de l'Organisation des Nations unies, Majesté, Altesse, Excellence, Monsieur le chef d'État et de gouvernement, chef de délégation, honorable assistance, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Permettez-moi tout d'abord d'adresser aux autorités américaines, au nom de la délégation comorienne, nos sincères remerciements pour l'accueil chaleureux et les excellentes dispositions prises à l'occasion de cette 80e session de notre Assemblée. Et je voudrais ensuite féliciter Son Excellence, Madame Alena Berkouk, pour son élection à la présidence de cette Assemblée et lui souhaiter bonne réussite dans sa noble mission, et par la même occasion, rendre un hommage à Son Excellence M. Philom Yang pour la sagesse et la rigueur avec lesquelles il a conduit les travaux précédents. Je salue enfin le leadership éclairé de Son Excellence M. Antonio Guterres, secrétaire général des Nations unies, dont l'engagement sans faille en faveur de la paix et du développement incarne fidèlement les idéaux de notre charte, alors que l'ordre international traverse malheureusement de profondes turbulences. Madame la Présidente, le thème de cette 80e session, Mieux ensemble, plus de 80 ans au service de la paix, du développement et des droits humains, prend toute sa pertinence et son urgence dans le contexte mondial actuel. Il y a 10 ans, ici même, nous avons fixé l'ambition d'un monde meilleur à l'horizon 2030. Les objectifs de développement durable devaient éradiquer la pauvreté, protéger la planète et offrir à tous la prospérité et la paix. Or, à 5 ans de cette échéance, force est de constater que le monde n'est ni plus juste, ni plus apaisé, ni plus équitable. Au contraire, les inégalités s'accentuent, les conflits se multiplient et l'humanité s'éloigne de la vision qui nous anime. C'est le cas en Europe avec le conflit ukrainien, et en Afrique avec la situation au Sahel et la crise des Grands Lacs. La tragédie palestinienne en est le témoignage le plus accablant. Depuis plus de 70 ans, et aujourd'hui encore plus qu'hier, le peuple palestinien endure la spoliation de sa terre, l'exil, la torture et l'humiliation. Son histoire récente n'est qu'une succession de pages écrites dans le sang, l'indifférence et le mépris. Face à ce drame, qualifié à juste titre de génocide par nombre d'experts, la communauté internationale se limite trop souvent à des condamnations verbales sans action concrète. Nous avons condamné à juste titre les actes barbares commis le 7 octobre 2023 en Israël. Mais la riposte disproportionnée qui se déroule à Gaza depuis relève bien d'un génocide dont les victimes sont à 80% des enfants, des personnes âgées, des malades, tués par des bombardements qui n'épargnent ni les hôpitaux, ni les écoles, ni les centres de distribution d'aide, ni les personnes de l'ONU, ni les journalistes. Les crimes perpétrés contre la Palestine révèlent une contradiction insoutenable. En effet, comment un gouvernement issu d'un peuple qui a été victime de l'Holocauste peut-il commettre un génocide au vu aussi du monde entier et imposer aujourd'hui à d'autres les traumatismes semblables de la guerre, de l'exil et de l'oppression? Comment Israël peut-il de surcroît s'en prendre à tous et être en conflit meurtrier avec tous ses voisins? Comme le rappelle un vieil adage, on ne choisit pas son voisin, mais on doit vivre en paix, en sécurité avec lui. Ainsi, nous ne pouvons que saluer le courage et l'humanisme des frères israéliens, des amis israéliens, qui élèvent leur voix contre cette barbarie. Bravo et merci à vous, chers amis. Et comme l'histoire nous le rappelle, devant la tragédie de l'Holocauste, les pays arabes, africains et musulmans n'ont jamais été du côté des génocidaires. Au contraire, nos aïeux et nos ancêtres ont, au péril de leur vie, combattu aux côtés des alliés pour défendre le peuple juif et les accueillir et les rescaper dans leur pays. Madame la Présidente, l'Union des Comores, fidèle à ses principes, au respect du droit international, réaffirme son soutien indéfectible à la solution à deux États vivant côte à côte, avec Jérusalem-Est comme capitale de l'État de Palestine, seule solution pour la paix et la sécurité pour Israël et pour toute la région du Proche et du Moyen-Orient. Contrairement à l'argumentaire selon lequel reconnaître l'État de Palestine, c'est faire un cadeau à Hamas, avoir un État palestinien reconnu permettra aux Palestiniens de se conformer, d'accomplir leurs devoirs aux obligations et au droit international. Cela constitue un meilleur gage de paix plutôt que d'avoir des groupes comme interlocuteurs. Nous saluons ainsi la décision historique de la France et nous rendons hommage au président Macron et aux dirigeants de nombreux pays qui ont reconnu lundi 23 septembre dernier l'État de Palestine depuis cette tribune de l'ONU. Nous nous réjouissons de cette heureuse initiative qui intervient à la suite de la déclaration de New York adoptée ce même mois de septembre par une auguste Assemblée générale et dans le droit fil de celle de la conférence internationale organisée en août dernier par la France et l'Arabie saoudite sous l'égide des Nations unies. Nous appelons cette Assemblée à inscrire de façon irréversible l'avenir de l'État palestinien au cœur de notre agenda commun. Il est de notre responsabilité morale et physique d'agir, car chaque jour qui passe sans action entraîne la mort de milliers innocents, femmes et enfants. Personne ne pourra plus dire « je ne savais pas ». L'histoire est un juge implacable, incorruptible, qui ne pardonnera ni le silence, ni l'action, ni l'inaction. Pensons aux futures générations pour que demain, ils soient fiers de nos actions. Madame la Présidente, La paix et le développement ne sauraient se construire sans justice et sans inclusion. Et c'est pourquoi, 65 ans après les indépendances, l'Afrique, continent de près de 2 milliards d'habitants, doit obtenir sa place légitime au sein du Conseil de sécurité des Nations unies. La vision de l'Union africaine, une Afrique unie, prospère, pacifique et actrice de son destin, rejoint pleinement l'esprit de cette session. Durant ma présidence de l'Union africaine, j'ai fait de la résolution des conflits et de la médiation une priorité afin de concrétiser l'ambition de faire taire les armes. Projet phare de l'Union africaine, dans le cadre de l'agenda 2063, l'Afrique que nous voulons est conformément aux normes et principes du protocole de l'Union africaine relatif à la réaction du Conseil de paix et de sécurité de l'Union africaine. Cet engagement est la clé de la mise en œuvre effective de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, pilier d'une Afrique forte dans le concert des nations. Madame la Présidente, honorable assistance, dans la même dynamique, je tiens à rappeler que la déclaration adoptée par l'Assemblée générale à sa 26e session a fait de l'océan Indien une zone de paix exempte d'armes nucléaires et de bases militaires. Or, aujourd'hui encore, des ambitions contraires menacent cette stabilité. Je dénonce ainsi avec fermeté tout projet d'installer une base navale militaire à Mayotte, île comorienne qui reste malheureusement toujours sous administration française. L'Union des Comores, qui vient de célébrer le cinquantenaire de son indépendance et de son admission aux Nations Unies, reste attachée au recouvrement intégral de son territoire national en jouant Grande Comore, Moélie et Mayotte. Je tiens à renouveler la gratitude du peuple et du gouvernement comorien à toutes celles, à tous ceux qui nous ont, à l'occasion de ce cinquantenaire, adressé leurs félicitations et leurs vœux. Et dans ce contexte, du haut de cette tribune, je ne peux passer sous silence la question de Mayotte, île comorienne toujours sous occupation française, malgré les options claires et répétées de l'ONU et entre autres de l'Union africaine et de la GRAB et d'autres structures. Le dialogue engagé avec la France, tout ce que fait le président Mitterrand a appelé à qualifier de contentieux et désagréable, doit aboutir, car ce différend qui n'a que trop duré coûte chaque année la vie à des milliers de nos compatriotes. Dans le bras de mer, séparant Mayotte et les autres îles sœurs. Cette semaine encore, des faits d'une extrême gravité ont été révélés par une enquête du journal Le Monde français qui fait état de manœuvres délibérées de la police opérant à Mayotte qui conduisent régulièrement au naufrage d'embarcations et qui provoquent la mort de plusieurs ressortissants comoriens. Ainsi, l'Union des Comores appelle à l'État français, puissance occupante, à faire arrêter ces opérations, à diligenter les enquêtes appropriées et à sanctionner les auteurs de cette barbarie pour que justice soit faite et pour que la dignité des vies humaines soit respectée. Pour sa part, l'Union des Comores poursuivra sans relâche son action diplomatique et juridique afin que justice soit rendue et pour qu'une solution juste soit trouvée à la question de l'île comorienne de Mayotte qui constitue l'une des dernières blessures de la décolonisation en Afrique. Nous nous désolons ainsi que certains pays frères africains qui ont défendu le droit international et la cause comorienne tergiversent aujourd'hui et prennent des initiatives malheureuses avec la France pour établir des relations avec Mayotte au mépris du droit international et de notre souveraineté nationale. Nous appelons l'Union africaine à agir pour rappeler le devoir et la nécessité du respect du droit international, de l'unité de notre archipel. Madame la Présidente, honorable assistance, comme beaucoup de petits États insulaires en développement, les Comores sont en première ligne face au changement climatique et restent un pays vulnérable mais déterminé. la montée des eaux, l'érosion côtière et la fréquence accrue des cyclones menacent nos villages, nos écosystèmes et nos vies. Nous appelons à un accès équitable et simplifié au financement climatique et à une solidarité accrue pour que nos populations puissent non seulement survivre, mais prospérer. Ces dernières années, l'Union des Comores a engagé un plan convergent d'ici 2030 qui vise à transformer notre économie, renforcer nos infrastructures, moderniser notre éducation et améliorer la santé de nos populations. Notre pays dispose d'immenses potentialités, entre autres, en matière d'énergie renouvelable, dont la géothermie. Nous invitons nos partenaires, bi et multilatéraux, et le secteur privé, de se joindre à nos projets de développement moteur d'avenir fondés sur 3 axes: la croissance inclusive, la transition énergétique et numérique, l'économie bleue, qui constitue une des richesses de l'océan Indien. La sécurité dans cette région dépend de la stabilité de chacun de ces États, et nous condamnons ainsi avec rigueur toutes les formes de terrorisme et de criminalité transnationale. Nous plaidons pour un multilatéralisme fort, juste et solidaire, fondé sur la Charte des Nations Unies et le respect de l'égalité souveraine des États. Nous devons réaffirmer notre engagement en faveur d'un ordre mondial plus équitable, où les petits États ont voix au chapitre et participent pleinement à la gouvernance mondiale. Et pour enrayer les dérives du protectionnisme et du repli sur soi, nous sommes partisans des réformes de l'architecture financière internationale. Après la pandémie de Covid-19, la crise climatique et l'endettement croissant des pays en développement, il est impératif d'adapter le système financier mondial aux réalités économiques, géopolitiques et sociales. 50 ans après la proclamation de son indépendance, la nation comore est encore jeune, mais forte de son expérience et de ses rêves. Le peuple comorien, fier de son histoire et confiant en son avenir, reste attaché à cette assemblée qui incarne nos aspirations communes à la paix, à la justice, au développement, qui doivent sans cesse être consolidées. J'appelle donc solennellement la communauté internationale et nos partenaires au développement à accompagner nos efforts comme gage d'un monde véritablement au service de la paix, du développement et des droits humains. Je vous remercie de votre aimable attention.
Au nom de l'Assemblée, je remercie le président de l'Union des Comores. L'Assemblée va maintenant entendre l'allocution de son Excellence Madame Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah, présidente de la République de Namibie. J'ai pris le protocole de bien vouloir accompagner son Excellence et je l'invite à prendre la parole devant l'Assemblée générale.
Thank you, Madam President. When the founders of the UN convened 8 years ago, they did so to establish an organization, among others, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, dignity of human person, and equal rights of men and women, and of nations, large and small, and to lay the groundwork for a durable system that promotes justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and international laws. While over the following decades, we have become closer to the brink of war, the United Nations has stood the test of time, from decolonization to promoting the right to self-determination, from conflict prevention and securing peace to the provision of humanitarian assistance. The UN has continued to fulfill its founding mandate under very difficult circumstances. Therefore, the international community must honor the brave men and women who, under the blue flag, have been at the forefront in the securing of world peace. Namibia's journey to independence is one of the UN's most successful stories. It was through this very organization that our forebears tirelessly petitioned for the end of apartheid, colonial rule in Namibia, for freedom and independence of our country. At this point, I want to thank the UN family for having held a special session in remembrance of our founding president, Comrade Sam Safishuna Nujoma, when he passed on. Madam President, my personal journey with the United Nations begins in 1974, where I have had the privilege to serve my country and Africa in various capacities within the halls of this distinguished global organ. Today, I am deeply honored and humbled to stand before you as the 5th President of the Republic of Namibia, with a mandate to deliver services and to ensure justice of all inhabitants of our country. As a woman, I encourage every girl and woman by affirming that your voice matters, your vision is needed, as it will pave you a way to the helm of whatever institution you are serving. Madam President, Namibia's 8th administration is built on the strong foundation and legacy of our predecessors. Under the theme, Unity in Diversity, Natural Resources Beneficiation, and Youth Empowerment for Sustainable Development. That theme aims to shape and transform the Namibian economy through value addition and other economic activities. Hence, we have identified agriculture, sports, youth empowerment, education and training, creative industry, health services, land and housing as critical sectors supported by mining, energy, water, tourism, infrastructure development, transport, logistics, to sustain our economic development through our long-term development blueprint, Vision 2030. This vision is being implemented through a series of national development plans, NDPs. Recently, we launched the 6th NDP with its fundamental pillars clearly aligned to the global agenda, such as the SADC Regional Industrial Strategic Development Plan, the African Union Agenda 2063, and the UN Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. Some of our achievements include the launch and the operationalization of the National Youth Fund, which is to assist young entrepreneurs in their economic activities. In the area of education, we will abolish registration and tuition fees in all public institutions of higher learning and vocational training centers to ensure skill development. On energy, Namibia is diversifying her energy mix using all our natural resources. In addition, Namibia presented her energy compact at the African Energy Forum, thus enabling us to access concessional funding for national energy initiatives. Madam President, climate change is scorching our lands and drying up our rivers. Global instability is impacting our economies, our markets, and jeopardizing our livelihood. These are interconnected symptoms of deeper fragility in our shared system. They require our collective action rooted in apathy and shared responsibility. In this regard, I am glad to announce Namibia's bid to host the Africa Regional Hub of the Green Climate Fund. Furthermore, severe droughts, floods, and other climatics brought about by climate change cannot be overemphasized. Namibia calls for the implementation of the provision of the Namib Declaration on a strong United Nations Convention to combat desertification for a land degradation and neutral world. Namibia acknowledges the technological advance in all fields, but ethical boundaries must be respected. However, artificial intelligence must not be a substitute for human judgment or responsibility. We therefore call for a global standard that ensures that the usage of artificial intelligence remains transparent, fair for humanity. Youth unemployment, increased economic inequality, lack of adequate housing, quality education and health care, water, energy, and debt distress are among the common challenges that no one country can address alone. Through multilateral cooperation, our collective action must ensure that we all forge ahead to make the world a better place and to work together on those challenges in line with our theme, Better Together. Madam President, 30 years since the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action, we have made much to celebrate and to ponder on. Namibia continues to make progress in the area of women participation in politics and decision-making. Currently, Namibia's cabinet has 57% of women. As we gear up to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, adopted during Namibia's presidency of the UN Security Council, Namibia will host 2 high-level events in Windhoek and New York. I look forward to the participation of all member states in those events to collectively reaffirm commitment to women, peace and security agenda. And through the Namibia International Women Peace Center, we will continue to advocate for the universal implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Madam President, we know to the ongoing efforts of the UN to ensure that we remain fit for purpose, including the UN Aid Initiative. We need an agile United Nations that is inclusive. Respect of the UN Charter and its purpose and principles must be our guiding star for our future endeavors. Madam President, we are meeting against a backdrop of profound global tension. The world is fractured by conflict, displacement, and economic instabilities straining multilateral cooperation and a serious issue for us to reach consensus. A global liquidity crisis threatens to plunge millions of people into poverty and insecurity. For Namibia, those crises are real. They impact our communities, test the resilience of our ecosystem, thus need urgent attention. In this context, the Southern Africa Development Community is committed to promoting peace, security, and stability in the Eastern DRC. Namibia welcomes the ongoing efforts by the AU, SADC, and AQ to align the Rwanda and Nairobi peace process and encourage the continued strengthening of political and security aspects of the challenges faced in our region. We further call upon UN Security Council and good office of the UN Secretary General to strengthen negotiation and peacekeeping initiatives towards resolutions of all conflict, including those in different parts of Africa. The impasse in the UN security over the question of Western Sahara is an injustice. More than 34 years after the adoption of the Resolution 690 of 1991, the time for the holding of the UN referendum on the right to self-determination for the people of Western Sahara is now. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the Rajoelina Consensus and the Third Declaration, which jointly constitute the common African position on the reform of the UN Security Council. We acknowledge the support from all interested groups for the common African position, which culminated in the recognition of Africa as a priority and a special case in the reform process, as reflected in the outcome document of relevant United Nations process, including the Pact for the Future. We can no longer delay the urgent call to redress the historical injustice to Africa and address our call for equitable and balanced representation on the Security Council. Madam President, the Charter of the United Nations has laid the foundation for conditions necessary for peaceful coexistence and harmony among nations. Therefore, unilateral cohesive measures should not be used as a tool to undermine sovereign state, for this violates the Charter and the principle of the United Nations. In this regard, we call for an end to the continued illegal economic, financial, and commercial embargo imposed on the friendly people of Cuba and removing her from the list of states sponsoring terrorism. We call for an end to the illegal sanctions on Zimbabwe. We are also gravely concerned about the emerging threats against Venezuela and call for the removal of sanctions and the threats against that country. Madam President, the UN Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestine territory, including Israel, Eastern Jerusalem, has just released its findings that indeed a genocide is being committed against the Palestine people. Despite the clear provision of the Security Council and General Assembly resolutions and advisory opinion rendered by the international community of justice, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is worsening, and access to humanitarian aid is severely limited. A failure to address the crisis in Gaza could become the moral failure that defines this era. We call on the UN Security Council to find consensus and help put an end to the lasting conflict between Israel and Palestine. Madam President, I call for a meaningful reform of the United Nations has a call for the meaningful reform of the United Nations has never been more urgent. This reform necessitated democratizing global governance, amplifying marginalized voices, and ensuring international law is not a tool for convenience, but a shield for most vulnerable. As I conclude, I wish to reaffirm Namibia's commitment to the international obligation and the multilateral order. Respect for international law is not just a legal duty, it's a moral imperative. We must reaffirm our commitment to the principle that unite us, mutual respect, and peaceful resolution of dispute, and solidarity in the face of common challenge. Let us remember that even the smallest nation have a voice. When those voices are heard and heeded, durable peace and justice will prevail. We have an obligation to make this our moment, not to despair, but renewal. We have the opportunity to restore hope, to build a future defined not only by division, but by unity and preservation of human dignity. I thank you for your kind attention.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier la présidente de la République de Namibie. L'Assemblée va maintenant entendre l'allocution de son Excellence M. Mohamed Irfan Ali, président de la République coopérative du Guyana. J'ai pris le protocole de bien vouloir accompagner son Excellence, que j'invite maintenant à prendre la parole.
President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, friends, I extend my heartfelt congratulations to Madam President on her election as President of the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I also record my profound appreciation for His Excellency Philemon Yang of Cameroon, whose distinguished stewardship and steady hand guided the 79th session. Today, as we mark the 80th anniversary of the entry into force of the United Nations Charter, we find ourselves at a crossroads. This organization, our organization, has delivered. From creating international law, promoting development and human rights, to resolving disputes, providing humanitarian aid, and advancing self-determination and independence. The fact remains, over these 8 decades, we have worked together for the greater good. From 51 member states in 1945 to 193 today, the UN has established itself as the premier organization for multilateralism. In fact, it is difficult to imagine our world without the United Nations. However, as it is with anniversaries, we must reflect honestly and candidly, where are we at 80? Conflicts are raging as geopolitical tensions intensify. Food insecurity is worsening. Displacement is growing. Human rights are being ignored, and climate change is threatening lives and livelihoods. Our sustainable development goals are imperiled by shrinking development and budget support. Spending on peacekeeping budgets is diminishing, and humanitarian costs are soaring. Meanwhile, global military spending in 2024 saw its steepest annual increase since the Cold War. President, the United Nations noble mission to maintain international peace and security will ring hollow if it allows power to triumph over principle and might to override right. In remaining faithful to its charter, the United Nations must ensure that the survival and progress of humanity are not mortgaged to the ambitions of the powerful. The collective will of our membership must be reflected in the institutions and governance structure of the United Nations, including the Security Council. On this note, as we prepare to leave the Security Council at the end of this year, I want to thank our permanent representative and a team from Guyana for their exceptional work at the Security Council and their leadership. It is precisely when the ideals of the United Nations are tested by horrific realities that the collective must act in defense of the UN Charter and international law. At present, a dark shadow looms over the 80th session of the General Assembly. Genocide in Palestine, annexation of Ukrainian territory, persecution of women in Afghanistan, humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan, brutal gang violence in Haiti, increased transnational organized crime, trafficking, and illegal immigration. All this as new challenges are emerging: cybercrime, cyberterrorism, and the pandemic of misinformation and disinformation, alongside the abuse of social media. President, whilst we reiterate our condemnation of the attacks by Hamas on Israel on October 7, 2023, and again call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, Israel's actions have long shattered any pretense of legitimate self-defense. What we are witnessing is not warfare, but mass extermination, a systematic slaughter and displacement of Palestinian men, women, and children. Those who escape the bombs and bullets are condemned to die slowly, starve of food, water, and hope. This is a war crime. The international community must not remain paralyzed while an entire people is annihilated. Impunity must never triumph over justice. We must take urgent action to halt the genocide, return the hostages, and accelerate our efforts towards a two-state solution. We urge Qatar, Egypt, and the United States to continue their efforts in this regard. Further, the situation in Ukraine remains of utmost concern. Guyana reiterates its call for an urgent end to the Russia-Ukraine war and reaffirms its support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Equally, the international community must act decisively in Haiti, where gang violence, displacement, and shortages of food and medicine have pushed the nation into deepening despair. Restoring security is the foremost priority, requiring strict enforcement of the arms embargo and robust support for a UN-authorized mission. I emphasize that without urgent humanitarian funding and a Haitian-led and owned political process, stability will remain elusive. We must address the root causes of Haiti's continuing troubles, including its historical debt burdens, which stymies its development, prospects, and upliftment of its people. As President Macron acknowledged, making Haiti pay for its independence was unjust. This is a welcome step. President, turning to my own country, Guyana, a small and peaceful state, we have endured repeated threats and aggression from the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The territorial controversy between our states is now before the International Court of Justice, which has twice reaffirmed its jurisdiction and which in 2023 issued provisional measures ordering Venezuela to refrain from altering the status quo. Yet, Venezuela persists with unilateral laws and threats of annexation, flagrantly violating international law, the UN Charter, and the very principles that sustain global order. If the rights of a small state can be trampled upon and legally binding orders ignored, what protection remains for any nation under international law? Yet, Guyana continues to repose confidence in international law. For us, the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference are non-negotiable. We will not cower to coercion, intimidation, or unilateral action. We thank our international partners and allies for their solidarity. President, at 80, the time has come for a frank conversation on Cuba, one that would lead to the prosperity of its people, optimizing the full potential Cuba offers to its people and the rest of the world. Central to this dialogue is the lifting of the embargo on Cuba and its removal from the list as a state sponsor of terrorism. Also important to our region is our collective effort against drug trafficking, human trafficking, and illegal migration. We support efforts by the international community to addressing these crimes that are destroying the lives of our people, especially young people. The region must continue to champion efforts to enhance democracy, promote good governance, and respect the will of the people in determining governments of their choice through free and fair elections. President, this year marks the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. The Declaration remains a blueprint for achieving gender equality, which, despite transformative strides, remains significantly unrealized in most parts of the world. In Guyana, the dividends of strategic investments in leadership and capacity building for women and girls are evident. More women have assumed leadership roles in government, in parliament, and in public and private sectors. We have achieved gender parity in education at all levels and advanced the socio-economic empowerment of women through land and home ownership and diverse job opportunities in traditional and emerging sectors. To enable women to participate equally and competitively in the workforce, government is offering child care support, which will include day and night care centers for children. President, survival of our people, our economies, and our planet depends on accelerating action on the Sustainable Development Goals. It requires a people-centered approach that prioritizes ending poverty and hunger, ensuring protection of children, support for persons with disabilities, and empowerment of young people. Peace, stability, and sustainable development cannot exist in isolation from the urgent need to address climate change, which poses an existential threat to the most vulnerable and to our shared future. Guyana repeats the call for accelerated, unified global action to limit global warming. We continue to match our words with actions, protecting our forests, investing in sea and river defenses, improving drainage and irrigation, and restoring mangrove ecosystems to protect our people, our land, our livelihoods, and our planet. Our low-carbon development strategy 2030 demonstrates that economic growth and environmental stewardship can advance hand in hand. As the first country certified under the REDD+ Environmental Excellence Standard and a successful seller of carbon credits, we are demonstrating that nature has tangible value and that innovation and responsibility can and must be rewarded. We call on the international community to deliver predictable, accessible climate finance, to support adaptation and resilience, and to embrace nature-based solutions. We once again commend Prime Minister Motley and the Bridgetown Initiative as the path towards sustainable financing for climate action. President, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Sustainable Development Goals. Yet, the slow pace of implementation and regression in many areas sound a stark warning that the promise of 2030 is at risk. Guyana calls for renewed global commitment to financing for development, including fulfilling official development assistance pledges, mobilizing domestic resources, and addressing the crippling debt burdens that hinder progress in many developing nations. Addressing these development challenges requires recognizing that the health of our ecosystems is inseparable from achieving the SDGs. Guyana proudly convened the inaugural Global Biodiversity Alliance Summit in Georgetown in July 2025, uniting over 140 countries, organizations, community groups, indigenous leaders, scientists, and financial institutions. The Georgetown Declaration, endorsed by this broad coalition of stakeholders, sends a clear and urgent message that biodiversity is a global public good and its protection must be woven into national development plans, climate strategies, and financial frameworks. Building on the global pledge to double protected areas by 2025 and achieve the 30 by 30 goal by 2030, the summit underscored the urgent need for innovative financing mechanisms, including biodiversity credit, green bonds, debt for nature swaps to fund nature's protection. Guyana is actively exploring biodiversity credits to create sustainable income streams for forest communities, building on our carbon credit success. We have signed a memorandum of understanding with the Yale Center for Biodiversity and Global Change to co-develop a national biodiversity information system, a digital backbone for data-driven conversation. Guyana is demonstrating that economic development and environmental stewardship can advance together by using natural gas as a bridge away from heavy fuel oil and investing in hydropower, solar, wind, and other renewables. We aim to lower electricity costs for our citizens and businesses while ensuring universal access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy. Guyana is pursuing an ambitious energy infrastructure and investment plan. While climate change is an existential threat, the reality is that the world still requires energy, an energy source from petroleum, to power growth and development for which there is growing demand. This is essential for the survival of our economies. AI and digitization are accelerating this demand at an extraordinary pace. As you're aware, Guyana is quickly becoming one of the world's largest energy producers per capita, carefully balancing its green footprint with energy production. We'll use our vast gas reserves through a transformational gas-to-energy project. We'll use this resource, taking advantage of our strategic geographic location, to establish an AI hyperscale data center. Large AI data centers are rarely found in similar-sized territories. As such, implementing a project of this scale is of immense pride for Guyana. This investment will improve the competitiveness of our region, accelerate digitization, build out a fintech ecosystem, modernize the service delivery platform of government, and accelerate private investment, bringing new job opportunities. We recognize the indispensable nature of AI in our collective future. However, while there are immense benefits, there is no clarity on equity, access, and applicability. Regulations, ethical standards, and governance mechanisms are urgently needed. In this regard, we welcome the recent UN General Assembly decision to establish 2 global AI governance mechanisms. President, I now turn to food security. Guyana is actively leading efforts to advance the CARICOM agri-food systems agenda through Vision 2030, aiming to boost food production, end hunger, and ensure food security across the Caribbean region. Our experience demonstrates that strategic investment and political will can transform national and regional food systems. Guyana calls for the transformation of global food systems to be more resilient, sustainable, and equitable by strengthening local production and reducing dependence on volatile markets. Guyana stands ready to share its experience and partner with others to ensure nutritious food for all. As the United Nations commemorates its 80th anniversary, let us recall that this organization was conceived not in comfort, but in crisis, forged from the ashes of war to serve as the conscience and compass of humanity. 8 decades later, that duty has not dimmed, it has only grown more urgent. If the UN is to remain humanity's best hope, it must stand firm against aggression and remain fully engaged with the great question of our time. We must be bold in recognizing the necessity for institutional adjustments that will advance the organization's success. Our generation will be judged not by the eloquence of our declaration, but by the substance of our deeds. From the ruins of Gaza to the streets of Haiti, from Kiev to the drowning coasts of small island states, the peoples of the world cry out for more than words. To honor 80 years of promise is to act with courage, to match principle with action, and to bind ourselves once more to the dream of a world united, not by fear or force, but by the shared destiny and enduring hope. I thank you, and may God bless all of our nations and all of our people. Thank you.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier le président de la République coopérative du Guyana. L'Assemblée va maintenant entendre une allocution de son Excellence M. Taneti Mamao, président et ministre des Affaires étrangères et de l'immigration dans la République de Kiribati. Je prie le protocole de bien vouloir accompagner son Excellence, que j'invite à prendre la parole devant l'Assemblée.
Madam President of the General Assembly, Head of States and Governments, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. In His holy name and on behalf of the government and the people of Kiribati, I extend our warm greetings to you all. I am honored to warmly congratulate you, Madam President, on your election to preside over this historic 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, and I wish you every success as you guide these important deliberations. Madam President, we commend your theme, Better Together, 80 years and more for peace and development and human rights, reminding us of the enduring importance of multilateral cooperation in addressing global challenges. For Kiribati, it underscores the value of working collectively to advance peace, safeguard human rights, and promote sustainable development. Your Excellencies, Kiribati welcomes the initiative of the Secretary General to reform the United Nations for the challenges and realities of the 21st century in order for it to respond more effectively to member needs, especially small island developing states or SIDS, and the least developed countries, LDS. These countries are faced with unique and special circumstances that require targeted assistance and support from the UN. The Secretary General's UN 80 initiative is a crucial step toward a more effective UN. In this context, we encourage reforms that remove duplication, improve efficiency, and ensure that mandates most vital to vulnerable nations, such as climate action, sustainable development, and resilience, are protected and enhanced. Kiribati is proud. Since joining the UN, we have been contributing in our way to its mandates and its initiatives. On the international level, especially peace and security, Kiribati has actively supported the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, particularly in the implementation of Article 6 and 7, efforts which we jointly coordinate with Kazakhstan. We fully support the United Nations push for a world free of nuclear weapons and are committed to addressing man-made disasters like dumping of nuclear waste, radioactivity wastewater discharges, and traversing of nuclear-powered submarines, and testing that pose grave risk to our oceans' fragile health. Advocating for a nuclear-free ocean and the world should be backed by our commitment to peace and security. Kiribati has strengthened governance in the capital and is now working with the outer highlands to improve accountability, develop relevant initiatives,
manage assets, and enhance customer service. These efforts are very essential for peace and security. Aligned with our KV20 roadmap to transform Kiribati into a healthy, wealthy, and peaceful nation, we sent our police officers to support the UN peacekeeping missions. Kiribati also actively engages in social and cultural initiatives for peaceful living. Gospel Day, now celebrated across Kiribati, unites all faith-based organizations to worship together, fostering respect, unity, and peace. We hope this approach promotes religious tolerance worldwide, making it a better place to live. Peace, security, and respect for the UN Charter are essential for sustainable development. Kiribati is committed to SDGs, emphasizing SIDS, or Small Island Developing States, unique circumstances. Along with the other SIDS in the Antigua and Barbuda Agenda for SIDS, ABES, we aim for resilient prosperity through technological and digital solutions. These innovations are vital to overcoming challenges from geographical isolation and limited economies of scale. While Kiribati has technological constraints, we see digital solutions as key to enhancing public services, education, commerce, and climate resilience. Kiribati faces climate challenges, but it remains resilient. While some narratives claim our islands are sinking, we have traditional and modern strategies to adapt and thrive. Our efforts, aligned with international climate goals, focus on building resilience, protecting livelihoods, and preserving our culture. We urge global action to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and support frontline states to the loss and damage fund. We welcome and commend the International Court of Justice in its landmark decision, giving its firm hope and assurance that Kiribati and other vulnerable countries will continue to exist in light of climate change impacts. This milestone demonstrates what the Blue Pacific can successfully achieve collectively, and that is to secure the full legal certainty and permanence of our maritime zones, irrespective of the impacts of climate change. The Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, the MVI, is particularly important for Kiribati as it captures the combined effect of economic, social, and environmental vulnerabilities that are not fully reflected in the income-based measures alone. By incorporating the MVI into development planning and international supports, countries like Kiribati can better access resources, build resilience, and implement effective strategies to achieve sustainable development despite our structural limitations. Kiribati's ocean is vital for its identity, economy, and food security. Protecting marine life, fighting illegal fishing, and supporting the BBNJ agreements are key to sustaining livelihoods and ecosystems. IUU fishing causes over $600 million annual loss, a moral and economic injustice that could fund universal child care. Guided by the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific, and recent UN Ocean Conference outcomes, Kiribati believes these issues can be addressed through strong multilateral ocean governance based on the UN principles. Your Excellencies, as part of Kiribati's efforts to support the global ocean commitments to protect and sustainably manage the marine resources, we have committed to increase the value of our tuna and maximize economic returns, and at the same time ensure that this resource is protected for our future generations to the parties of the Nauru Agreement or the PNA. Access to sustainable and renewable energy is fundamental to advancing development and resilience in Kiribati. Small island states and Pacific Islands Forum family at large access to sustainable development and renewable energy is fundamental to advancing development and resilience in Kiribati, as well as small island states and Pacific Islands Forum family at large. Kiribati is investing in clean energy technologies, such as solar lights at household levels, to reduce our dependence on imported fossil fuels. We call for the enhanced international cooperation and financing to accelerate the transition to sustainable energy systems that are accessible, affordable, and climate resilient. Your Excellencies, the role of education, youth, and women in building resilient communities is vital. Investing in quality education, promoting gender equality, and empowering young people are key to sustainable development, innovation, and social cohesion. We support initiatives that foster youth leadership and women's full participation in the economic, political, and social spheres. Sports, culture, and traditional knowledge further boost community resilience, health, and belonging, supporting peaceful and sustainable societies. Healthcare in Kiribati faces challenges from the dispersed nature of the islands. To improve, the government will introduce sea ambulances and advance medical services to enhance capacity and reduce the need for overseas referrals. Your Excellencies, equitable and predictable development financing is vital for Kiribati's future. Reforming the international financial system, improving access to concessional finance, data, sustainability, and bridging the digital divide are key to enabling states to meet their development goals. The Blue Pacific recognizes the challenge of accessing climate financing and supports the establishment of the Pacific Resilience Facility, led and known by members, with $162 million pledged to fund it. Kiribati highlights the importance of the Doha Programme of Action for Least Developed Countries, which mobilizes international support for the most vulnerable. We await the UN financing for development conference, hoping it would provide concrete solutions to improve access to finance for those in need. These efforts are crucial for less developing countries like Kiribati to build resilience and promote sustainable development. Kiribati reaffirms its belief in the fundamental principle of multilateralism as the cornerstone for addressing global challenges collectively. By embracing cooperation, solidarity, and multilateral engagement, we can shape a future in which all nations, particularly the vulnerable, can thrive and prosper. In this endeavor, we draw inspirations from the wisdom of our forefathers, who taught us that by working hard in resilience and peace, we can secure enough to prosper. This enduring principle guides Kiribati's approach to sustainable development, resilience, and multilateral engagement, reminding us that collective efforts and peaceful collaborations are the foundation of lasting progress. Allow me to close by bestowing upon the United Nations and all its members and all its staff our traditional blessings of the Maori, the Roi, the Tabamoa, meaning abundant health, peace, and prosperity. I thank you, Ambassador.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier le Président et ministre des Affaires étrangères et de l'Immigration de la République de Kiribati. L'Assemblée va entendre l'allocution de son Excellence M. Bassirou Diomaye Diakhar Faye, Président de la République du Sénégal. J'ai pris le protocole de bien vouloir accompagner son Excellence, que j'invite à prendre la parole devant l'Assemblée.
Madame la Présidente de l'Assemblée générale, chers collègues, Monsieur le Secrétaire général, Mesdames, Messieurs, distingués délégués, Madame la Présidente, au nom du Sénégal, je remercie votre prédécesseur et vous adresse tous nos vœux de succès à la présidence de cette 80e session de l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies. Je renouvelle au secrétaire général, M. Antonio Guterres, notre soutien constant dans l'exercice de sa haute charge au service des États membres. Nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui en ces lieux symboliques du dialogue universel, comme porteurs du poids de l'histoire et de l'urgence du présent. Le thème de cette session, Mieux ensemble, 80 ans et plus pour la paix, le développement, les droits de l'homme, nous rappelle en effet le pacte fondateur des Nations unies, un pacte de coexistence pacifique, de sécurité collective et d'un ordre international fondé sur le droit. Sur cette base, les Nations unies ont accompli des progrès indéniables dans la coopération solidaire pour la prévention des conflits, la promotion de la paix et de la sécurité internationale et le règlement des différends. De même, des progrès significatifs ont été réalisés dans la codification de normes universelles pour la protection des droits de l'homme et d'un ordre international plus sûr et plus apaisé. Mais 80 ans après la création des Nations unies, le monde vacille à nouveau, comme si nous étions rattrapés par les dérives qui ont mené l'humanité à 2 catastrophes majeures en l'espace d'une génération. Nous vivons des moments de forte turbulence, de défis inédits et d'incertitudes multiples. Expansion du terrorisme, persistance de conflits anciens et nouveaux, dérèglement climatique, crise économique profonde, recul de la solidarité internationale et risque élevé de désintégration du multilatéralisme. Je n'oublie pas la course aux armements, y compris dans le cyberespace. Le plus préoccupant, c'est la déshumanisation désolante d'un monde d'émotions sélectives selon les intérêts et les enjeux géopolitiques. Il ne peut y avoir de justice fondée sur le droit quand ce qui tient lieu d'ordre international est régi par la logique du 2 poids 2 mesures, par la loi du plus fort et l'esprit partisan. Dans ce contexte préoccupant, l'Afrique reste confrontée à des conflits armés, au terrorisme, en particulier au Sahel, à la criminalité transfrontalière et à l'instabilité politique. Face à tant de défis, notre approche devrait être intégrée, combinant prévention, résilience et réponse ciblée. La paix et la sécurité ont un prix. Donnons-nous les moyens de l'assumer par un financement prévisible et pérenne des opérations de soutien à la paix en Afrique, avec des équipements adéquats et des mandats et règles d'engagement robustes. C'est la seule façon de faire face au fléau du terrorisme et de rétablir un minimum de sécurité et de stabilité dans les zones affectées. Je renouvelle ici la solidarité du Sénégal envers les pays frères engagés au quotidien dans la lutte contre le terrorisme. Au Moyen-Orient, le peuple palestinien continue de vivre la pire des calamités que les mots ne peuvent plus exprimer. Sous le fracas quotidien des bombes, toutes les limites ont été dépassées. Nous ne pouvons ni nous taire, ni détourner notre regard, car Gaza ne vit plus. Gaza, terre de larmes, de sang et de sueur, est devenue un enfer pour des millions d'âmes de tous âges, piégées dans une prison à ciel ouvert. Hommes, femmes et enfants agonisent tous les jours, privés de nourriture, d'eau et de soins de santé. Le Sénégal réitère sa ferme condamnation de cette tragédie que rien ne saurait justifier. En sa qualité de président du Comité pour l'exercice des droits inaliénables du peuple palestinien, le Sénégal considère que seule la création d'un État palestinien indépendant et viable apportera une paix durable pour toutes les parties, chacune à l'intérieur de frontières sûres et internationalement reconnues. Mesdames, Messieurs, il y a 80 ans, les pères fondateurs s'engageaient à travers la création de l'ONU à préserver les générations futures du fléau de la guerre, qui par 2 fois, en l'espace d'un quart de siècle, avait causé des millions de morts et d'indicibles souffrances. Au nom du Sénégal, je rends hommage aux pionniers et à tous ceux qui ont incarné les valeurs universelles de l'organisation, parfois au péril de leur vie. Dans ce monde en crise, les principes et les actes doivent rester les mêmes. La paix plutôt que les conflits, la justice plutôt que l'indifférence, le partenariat plutôt que les rapports de force. Mais cela n'est possible que par un multilatéralisme fort et revitalisé, pour en faire un cadre unique d'action, pour la paix, la stabilité, par le dialogue, la concertation et la résolution pacifique des différends. La survie du multilatéralisme exige qu'il retrouve ses principes fondamentaux, la responsabilité partagée et une solidarité active, le respect du droit international et une justice universelle conformément au statut de la Cour internationale de justice et de la Cour pénale internationale. En outre, nous ne pouvons occulter l'impératif de réforme de la gouvernance politique, économique et financière mondiale. L'ONU, par sa vocation universelle, doit agir en pionnière. Des délibérations et des décisions plus démocratiques, plus légitimes et plus représentatives de ses États membres, qui sont passés de 51 à 1945 à 193 aujourd'hui. Je renouvelle le soutien du Sénégal au consensus des Oulouini pour une représentation plus juste et plus équitable de l'Afrique au Conseil de sécurité. Il est temps d'instaurer une gouvernance économique et financière mondiale plus juste et plus inclusive, pour répondre aux besoins de financement du développement durable. Nous savons tous que l'aide publique n'est pas la solution. D'autres leviers existent, notamment un cadre fiscal mondial équitable, afin que l'impôt soit payé là où la richesse est produite. L'accès au crédit dans des conditions soutenables, afin que la gestion du fardeau de la dette n'entrave pas les efforts de développement de nos pays. Enfin, la mise en œuvre effective de l'engagement de Séville, du pacte pour l'avenir et des objectifs de développement durable, pour un accès élargi à la santé, à l'eau, à la nourriture, à l'éducation, à l'énergie et au numérique. Le réchauffement climatique mérite aussi notre attention. Il n'est pas seulement une menace, mais une question existentielle. Une réalité qui frappe plus durement ceux qui y contribuent le moins, comme l'Afrique, avec moins de 4% des émissions mondiales. Et pourtant, sécheresse, inondations, érosion côtière et insécurité alimentaire rythment désormais la vie de nos populations. C'est une double peine devenue insoutenable. Le Sénégal renouvelle son attachement à l'accord de Paris sur le climat et appelle à une transition climatique juste et équitable par l'exploitation de nos ressources disponibles pour l'accès universel à l'électricité et l'amorce d'une industrialisation compétitive. La lutte contre le réchauffement climatique se fera indubitablement avec des financements conséquents pour l'adaptation, la simplification et l'accès aux fonds climatiques, ainsi que la garantie de transfert de technologies. Le Sénégal salue la création du fonds pour répondre aux pertes et dommages et appelle à la mobilisation de la solidarité internationale pour la constitution de ces ressources afin de financer les opérations sur le terrain. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, face aux urgences et aux défis nombreux et complexes, nous ne sommes pas démunis. Le monde dispose des moyens nécessaires pour nourrir ceux qui ont faim, éduquer nos enfants, soigner les malades et faire taire les armes. Le véritable obstacle n'est ni financier, ni technique, ni matériel. Il est dans la volonté politique de faire du multilatéralisme un instrument de solidarité collective, de coopération plutôt que de confrontation, pour un avenir où la dignité humaine sera au cœur de nos décisions. Alors, faisons de ce 80e anniversaire des Nations Unies, non pas le constat d'un ordre épuisé, mais le point de départ d'un nouvel espoir, celui d'une organisation rénovée et plus efficace, au service des peuples qu'elle incarne. Le Sénégal reste fidèle à son engagement de travailler dans ce sens avec tous les membres de l'organisation, prêt à jeter les ponts, prêt à porter les réformes, prêt à poursuivre notre œuvre commune pour un monde de paix, de justice et de solidarité. Je souhaite plein succès aux travaux de la 80e session de l'Assemblée générale et vous remercie de votre aimable attention.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier le président de la République du Sénégal. L'Assemblée va entendre l'allocution de son Excellence M. Peter Pellegrini, président de la République slovaque. J'ai pris le protocole de...
Madame la Présidente de l'Assemblée générale, Majesté, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement, Monsieur le Secrétaire général des Nations Unies, distingués délégués, Mesdames et Messieurs, c'est avec un profond sentiment de responsabilité que je prends la parole au nom du peuple centrafricain, alors que notre organisation célèbre ses 80 ans d'existence. Cet anniversaire nous rappelle une vérité simple. Nos destins sont liés. L'humanité est une et indivisible. Nos peuples ne peuvent prospérer que si la paix est assurée, si le développement est partagé et si la dignité humaine est garantie pour tous. 80 ans après la fondation de l'ONU, le monde fait face à une accumulation de menaces inédites. Guerres persistantes, rivalités géopolitiques, montée du terrorisme et du crime organisé, crise climatique, humanitaire et alimentaire sans précédent. Jamais, depuis la guerre froide, nous avons vu une telle fragilité. En Europe, la guerre en Ukraine continue de causer d'immenses souffrances humaines et de fragiliser la stabilité mondiale. Au Moyen-Orient, les violences persistantes entre Israël et la Palestine plongent des générations entières dans la douleur et compromettent les espoirs de coexistence pacifique. En Afrique, les crises au Soudan, à l'est de la République démocratique du Congo, au Sahel et dans la Corne de l'Afrique rappellent la fragilité des équilibres et l'urgence d'un soutien accru à la prévention et à la résolution pacifique des différends. Face à ces situations dramatiques, la République centrafricaine propose le renforcement des mécanismes de la diplomatie préventive de l'ONU en créant un fonds mondial de prévention des conflits, alimenté par les grandes puissances et géré de façon transparente. Ce fonds devrait permettre de financer, dès les premiers signaux de crise, des missions de bons offices, des médiations internationales et le déploiement de forces de maintien de la paix rapides et crédibles. De même, il nous faut systématiser la création de coalitions régionales de médiateurs capables d'agir en complément des Nations unies pour éviter que les différends locaux ne se transforment en guerre ouverte. Madame la Présidente, si nous voulons mesurer la gravité du moment, regardons particulièrement l'Afrique. En 2025, plus de 40% des conflits armés dans le monde se déroulent sur ce continent. Le Sahel seul concentre des milliers de victimes chaque année et des millions de déplacés. Un seul chiffre suffit à résumer l'urgence. Dans certaines régions africaines, un enfant sur deux vit dans une zone touchée par un conflit. Comment parler d'avenir lorsque la moitié d'une génération est menacée par la guerre? Pour la République centrafricaine, nous savons que notre stabilité conditionne celle de toute l'Afrique centrale. Nous savons aussi que la paix n'est jamais acquise, mais toujours à construire avec patience et solidarité. Pour mitiger les effets néfastes du changement climatique, nous appelons à un mécanisme africain intégré de sécurité alimentaire et climatique, soutenu par l'ONU, pour réduire le lien entre rareté des ressources et conflits. Nous demandons un financement structurel et pérenne des opérations de paix en Afrique, reposant sur des contributions obligatoires et non sur le volontariat. Nous affirmons que la paix doit être inclusive, en garantissant la participation des femmes et des jeunes. Sans sécurité, il n'y a ni prospérité, ni droits humains effectifs. Face aux conflits et aux crises humanitaires qui ont mis à rude épreuve notre monde, nous devons collectivement rappeler la force normative de la Charte des Nations unies. Ce texte fondateur qui, en 1945, portait l'espérance d'un monde libéré du fléau de la guerre. Mais aujourd'hui, 80 ans plus tard, la question se pose. L'ONU est-elle encore capable de remplir cette mission? La multiplication des conflits, la fragmentation du monde en blocs antagonistes, l'usage abusif du droit de veto et la paralysie du Conseil de sécurité nous donnent l'impression d'une organisation à bout de souffle. Pourtant, ce n'est pas l'ONU qui est fatiguée, ce sont les États membres qui, en manquant de volonté politique, bloquent son action. Oui, Madame la Présidente, l'ONU peut encore peser dans le concert des nations, mais à une condition, que nous, ses membres, choisissons le consensus plutôt que la division, l'unité plutôt que le blocage. Je salue et j'encourage les efforts constants de la communauté internationale pour favoriser les issues pacifiques aux différents conflits. Car chaque jour qui passe prolonge l'agonie d'innocents et fragilise la paix mondiale. En Afrique, notamment au Soudan, les conflits irrésolus déchirent un peuple frère et risquent de transformer notre continent en une mosaïque d'États confettis, incapables d'assurer la stabilité ni de répondre aux besoins de leurs concitoyens. Cette perspective est inacceptable. L'Afrique appelle à une mobilisation urgente, non pas pour militariser davantage nos territoires, mais pour investir dans la paix, la médiation et le dialogue inclusif. C'est pourquoi mon pays soutient la déclaration du Quad initiée par l'Égypte, l'Arabie saoudite, les Émirats arabes unis et les États-Unis d'Amérique concernant le rétablissement de la paix et de la sécurité au Soudan. Dans mon propre pays, la République centrafricaine, nous avons choisi cette voie du dialogue. La politique de la main tendue a permis, à travers la réconciliation et la confiance restaurée, l'autodissolution de la quasi-totalité des groupes armés. Ce choix n'a pas été le plus facile. Il aurait été plus simple de céder à la logique des armes, mais nous avons préféré l'audace du pardon, la patience du dialogue et la force du consensus. Notre expérience montre qu'il est possible de substituer au cycle de la haine une dynamique de paix durable. La République centrafricaine, jadis considérée comme un théâtre de violence, est aujourd'hui un exemple qu'il est possible de tendre la main et d'obtenir en retour non pas la guerre, mais la paix. Grâce à la paix retrouvée, nous préparons aujourd'hui en toute sérénité les élections générales de décembre 2025 que nous voulons démocratiques, inclusives et transparentes pour consolider l'ancrage démocratique du pays amorcé depuis 2016. Nous proposons que ce modèle soit étudié et renforcé comme bonne pratique africaine dans le cadre des Nations Unies et de l'Union africaine. Cette bonne pratique exige des actes politiques courageux. Réformer l'ONU, réformer l'architecture financière mondiale, créer un fonds mondial de prévention, renforcer le rôle des organisations régionales, mobiliser les grandes puissances, non pas pour diviser, mais pour nous unir. La République centrafricaine, forte de son expérience, se tient prête à apporter son expérience à ce vaste chantier pour bâtir un ordre mondial fondé sur la justice, la dignité humaine et le respect du droit international. Mais la paix ne peut suffire sans le développement. Le programme de développement durable à l'horizon 2030 reste notre cap commun. Nous travaillons à réduire la pauvreté, à renforcer la sécurité alimentaire, à promouvoir l'éducation et la santé comme levier de dignité, à engager des réformes pour une croissance inclusive, créatrice d'emplois et respectueuse de l'environnement. La République centrafricaine vient aujourd'hui affirmer une conviction simple. Le développement durable et la coopération internationale sont les clés de la paix mondiale. Dans un monde où les crises s'enchaînent et s'entrelacent, aucun pays ne peut relever seul les défis du siècle. Nous avons besoin d'une solidarité active. Nous avons besoin d'une prospérité véritablement partagée. Nous avons besoin d'un sursaut d'humanité. Pour ce sursaut d'humanité, permettez-moi, Madame la Présidente, de livrer 3 messages simples mais essentiels. Premièrement, le développement inclusif est une arme de prévention. Là où il y a exclusion, pauvreté, injustice, la colère s'installe, les rancunes s'accumulent et les conflits éclatent. Mais là où l'on investit dans l'éducation, la santé et l'emploi, ce sont les germes de la paix qui poussent. Une école ouverte, ce n'est pas seulement des bancs remplis d'élèves, c'est une société qui choisit l'avenir plutôt que la violence. Un emploi créé, ce n'est pas seulement un revenu, c'est une dignité préservée et une famille qui croit de nouveau à la paix. Deuxièmement, la coopération internationale est vitale. Nos défis ignorent les frontières. Le climat, les pandémies, les migrations, les marchés, tout cela dépasse les capacités de chaque État isolé. Aucun mur, aucun port fermé, aucune barrière ne protège durablement contre une tempête, un virus ou un désespoir migratoire. La seule protection, c'est l'action collective, c'est le multilatéralisme. Troisièmement, le développement durable est aussi une dette morale envers nos enfants. Leur laisserons-nous une planète exsangue, une dette écologique et sociale qui les condamnera avant même d'avoir commencé leur vie d'adulte? Ou leur transmettrons-nous un monde plus juste, plus vert, plus digne? Ce choix ne peut plus attendre. Madame la Présidente, pour un monde plus juste, la République centrafricaine souhaite aujourd'hui tracer des chemins d'avenir en partageant 3 pistes qui ne sont pas de simples propositions techniques, mais des choix de civilisation. D'abord, il nous faut imaginer une initiative mondiale pour la reconstruction des États fragiles, car dans un monde qui laisse certains de ses membres brisés, ne peut pas prétendre à la paix universelle. Les nations meurtries par les conflits ne doivent plus rester seules à panser leurs plaies. Elles ont besoin d'une communauté internationale qui les relève, les accompagne et leur redonne confiance. Investir dans la reconstruction institutionnelle, c'est refuser le cycle sans fin de la guerre et du désespoir. À cette reconstruction institutionnelle doit ensuite s'ajouter un engagement fort pour notre planète. C'est pourquoi nous appelons à un pacte des Nations Unies pour la protection des écosystèmes critiques, un pacte qui relie le climat, la biodiversité et les droits humains. Détruire une forêt, ce n'est pas seulement abattre des arbres, c'est effacer des cultures, menacer des vies et préparer les crises de demain. Protéger la nature, c'est protéger la paix. Enfin, il est temps de rêver grand pour l'Afrique. C'est le sens de l'idée d'un corridor vert de développement en Afrique centrale qui allie infrastructures modernes, énergie propre et intégration régionale. De Bangui à Kinshasa, de Douala à Libreville, ce corridor serait un trait d'union entre nos peuples et une promesse d'avenir pour toute l'humanité. Car l'Afrique n'est pas un continent à assister, elle est un continent à relever. Elle n'attend ni charité ni compassion, mais des partenariats justes et courageux. L'ère de la dépendance de l'Afrique est révolue. Le rôle de l'Afrique dans le concert des nations doit être respecté. Souveraineté et non subordination. Partenariat et non exploitation. Il est inadmissible de voir la pauvreté s'aggraver en Afrique, tandis que la richesse s'accumule dans les pays du Nord. Il est temps que les injustices causées à l'Afrique soient réparées. C'est pourquoi la République centrafricaine soutient l'initiative panafricaine sur les réparations, ainsi que les efforts du continent tendant à établir un dialogue respectueux et équitable avec les partenaires. Dans cette veine, mon pays soutient l'initiative pour la gouvernance mondiale lancée le 1er septembre 2025 par la Chine et qui s'inscrit dans le prolongement des initiatives mondiales pour le développement, la sécurité et la civilisation, mettant l'accent sur la construction d'un système de gouvernance internationale plus juste et plus équitable. Madame la Présidente, nous sommes tous d'accord sur le principe du développement durable. Mais deux obstacles demeurent, le financement et la répartition des responsabilités entre le Nord et le Sud. Sur ces deux points, il est temps de parler vrai. Chacun doit prendre sa part selon ses moyens et ses responsabilités historiques. Car la solidarité n'est pas une option morale, c'est une obligation politique. Cette obligation politique implique que le développement durable est la condition même de notre avenir commun. La République centrafricaine, en dépit de ses modestes moyens, mais forte d'une volonté politique inébranlable, prend toute sa place dans ce combat collectif. Nous savons que nous sommes vulnérables, mais nous savons aussi que notre vulnérabilité nous donne une voie unique, celle qui rappelle au monde que la paix, la justice et la solidarité ne sont pas des promesses lointaines, mais des choix urgents, ici et maintenant. En ce 20e anniversaire, la République centrafricaine réaffirme son attachement indéfectible aux valeurs incarnées par l'ONU. Mais elle souligne que ces valeurs ne peuvent être garanties sans une réforme profonde du système multilatéral et en particulier du Conseil de sécurité des Nations unies, dont la composition actuelle est devenue anachronique et voire illégitime. Il y a 80 ans, lorsque les Nations unies sont nées, l'Afrique n'était pas libre. La plupart de nos pays vivaient encore sous la tutelle coloniale. Notre voix ne comptait pas. Aujourd'hui, l'Afrique, c'est 1,4 milliard d'habitants. Dans 30 ans, ce sera 2,5 milliards. Un être humain sur 4 sera africain. L'Afrique sera le continent le plus jeune et le plus décisif du siècle. Et pourtant, pas un seul siège permanent au Conseil de sécurité n'appartient à l'Afrique. Pas un seul. Comment parler de sécurité et de justice internationale quand le continent de demain est traité comme celui d'hier? La République centrafricaine porte ici la voix de l'Afrique pour dire assez. L'Afrique doit avoir 2 sièges permanents avec droit de veto, non par faveur, mais par justice, non par privilège, mais par nécessité. Nous proposons aussi la création d'une charte mondiale pour la gouvernance numérique et l'intelligence artificielle éthique, afin que les droits humains soient protégés dans l'espace digital. Nous appelons à la mise en place d'un indice mondial d'équité et de résilience démocratique, complémentaire au PIB, pour mesurer la dignité, la justice et l'inclusion. Mon pays agit déjà à son échelle. Nous avons validé notre 3e rapport sur la résolution 1325, Femmes, paix et sécurité. Nous avons actualisé notre plan de suivi Beijing +30. Nous renforçons nos mécanismes nationaux de redevabilité pour placer les femmes, les jeunes et les plus vulnérables au cœur des politiques publiques. En ce 80e anniversaire de l'ONU, rappelons la vision des fondateurs, remplacer la force des puissants par la force du droit et bâtir un avenir de dignité pour tous. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie le président de la République centrafricaine. Excellence, l'Assemblée va maintenant entendre l'allocution de Son Excellence M. Bajram Begaj, président de la République d'Albanie. Je prie le protocole de bien vouloir accompagner Son Excellence, que j'invite maintenant à prendre la parole.
Madame la Présidente de l'Assemblée générale, Monsieur le Secrétaire général de l'Organisation des Nations unies, Mesdames et Messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement, distingués délégués, Mesdames et Messieurs, c'est avec gravité et aussi avec une foi intacte dans les idéaux de l'Organisation des Nations unies que je m'adresse à vous aujourd'hui. Nous sommes rassemblés à un moment de bascule, à une époque où notre responsabilité collective n'a jamais été aussi grande. Nous vivons une période marquée par des tensions accrues, des menaces multiples et des fractures profondes. Et pourtant, jamais le monde n'a eu autant besoin d'unité, de coopération, de dialogue. Ce qui est en jeu, ce n'est pas seulement la paix ou le développement, c'est bien l'avenir même du multilatéralisme et de cette précieuse humanité que nous avons en partage. Il y a 80 ans, après les horreurs de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, les fondateurs des Nations unies se réunissaient avec la ferme intention d'établir un ordre international juste et durable. Ils rêvaient d'un monde où la coopération et la solidarité seraient les maîtres mots. Un monde où la diplomatie et le dialogue se substitueraient aux conflits violents. Leur projet était ambitieux. Il demeure totalement d'actualité. L'Organisation des Nations unies a été fondée sur le socle de deux principes majeurs. La solidarité internationale, c'est-à-dire la conviction que le destin des nations est intrinsèquement lié et que seul un effort collectif peut permettre de relever les défis mondiaux. Le multipartisme, ou la reconnaissance de ce que chaque nation, grande ou petite, doit avoir voix au chapitre dans les affaires internationales et que seule une action collective peut garantir une paix durable. Malheureusement, 80 ans après sa création, notre organisation est confrontée à la résurgence inquiétante des conflits armés à travers le monde. Dans tant d'endroits, le langage des armes a repris le dessus sur le bon sens et la diplomatie. C'est l'échec de notre promesse collective. C'est de bâtir un monde libéré du fléau de la guerre. C'est aussi le signe d'un système international affaibli, parfois impuissant, face aux logiques de confrontation. Aujourd'hui, il nous faut réaffirmer la primauté du droit dans les affaires internationales et la nécessité d'un ordre mondial fondé, non pas sur la force des armes, mais sur des règles établies et communément partagées. Les Nations unies doivent redevenir un instrument efficace de prévention des conflits et de médiation. Acteurs épris de paix et de justice, qui œuvrent pour l'amitié entre tous les peuples du monde. Le Congo soutient la coexistence pacifique, la tolérance réciproque et la compréhension mutuelle. C'est pourquoi, au Moyen-Orient, mon pays soutient sans réserve la solution à 2 États, israélien et palestinien, vivant côte à côte en paix. Dans les Caraïbes, mon pays continuera de soutenir le peuple cubain, exténué par des décennies d'un embargo aujourd'hui incompréhensible. Les tensions commerciales, technologiques et géopolitiques entre grandes puissances et dont nous sommes aujourd'hui témoins fragmentent évidemment notre monde et alimentent la méfiance entre les nations. Elles affaiblissent les chaînes de solidarité internationale et compromettent notre capacité à relever ensemble les grands défis globaux avec de grandes conséquences sur les économies des pays en développement. Cela se traduit notamment par l'instabilité des marchés, l'augmentation des prix des matières premières et des perturbations récurrentes sur les chaînes d'approvisionnement. Or, pour compréhensible qu'elle puisse être, la compétition économique ne devrait pas se transformer en une confrontation systémique. L'une des grandes réussites des Nations unies a indubitablement, indéniablement été d'établir une plateforme solide de coopération entre les nations. Mais aujourd'hui, ce multilatéralisme est menacé par des égoïsmes nationaux et par des politiques unilatérale, source de crises diplomatiques préjudiciables. Cette tendance doit être inversée parce que les défis mondiaux que nous affrontons, notamment le changement climatique, les pandémies et l'insécurité alimentaire, nécessitent une réponse mondiale solidaire, cohérente et concertée. La République du Congo croit fermement qu'une organisation des Nations Unies plus forte et plus efficace est la condition indispensable pour préserver la paix et garantir le développement durable. C'est pourquoi nous en appelons à une réforme de ces organes, à commencer par son Conseil de sécurité, afin de les rendre plus représentatifs, plus transparents et plus proches des réalités de notre monde. On le voit bien, le Conseil de sécurité, dans sa composition actuelle, ne reflète plus les équilibres géopolitiques de notre monde. Il est donc urgent de le réformer, non pas en théorie, mais en pratique. L'Afrique ne peut plus rester marginalisée. C'est un continent de plus d'1,4 milliard d'habitants. C'est un continent d'avenir, de jeunesse, de potentiel, auquel nous devons aujourd'hui garantir une participation pleine et entière aux décisions mondiales. Je le dis avec force, l'Afrique mérite une représentation permanente au sein du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies. Pas en tant que bénéficiaire d'une faveur, mais en tant que partenaire légitime. C'est l'appel solennel que la République du Congo lance du haut de cette tribune. Il nous faut inventer un multilatéralisme plus intelligent, plus efficace, plus proche des aspirations des peuples, plus représentatif des réalités du XXIe siècle. Ce multilatéralisme doit aussi se traduire en actes concrets, en résultats tangibles, en solutions durables. Les peuples du monde ne nous jugeront pas sur nos discours, mais sur ce que nous aurons su accomplir ensemble. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs, il ne peut y avoir de paix durable sans développement et inversement. La pauvreté, les inégalités, le chômage des jeunes, l'exclusion sont des terreaux dont se nourrissent les frustrations, l'instabilité et l'extrémisme violent. Nous devons honorer nos engagements pour le financement des objectifs de développement durable et mettre fin aux mécanismes qui étranglent les économies vulnérables, comme la dette insoutenable ou les règles commerciales inéquitables. La solidarité internationale reste essentielle pour permettre aux pays en développement de réussir leur transition vers un avenir plus prospère. C'est pourquoi nous devons investir massivement dans l'éducation, la santé, l'agriculture, les infrastructures, les technologies nouvelles, l'intelligence artificielle, etc. Le défi climatique nous interpelle très fortement aujourd'hui. Il transcende toutes les frontières, tous les clivages et toutes les idéologies. Il frappe déjà nos villes, nos campagnes, nos écosystèmes. Il aggrave les conflits, détruit des cultures millénaires et pousse les familles entières sur les routes de l'exil. Face à cela, nous n'avons plus le droit d'agir en ordre dispersé. Nous devons partir en rang serré, dans la solidarité et avec détermination. Cela implique le respect des engagements de l'accord de Paris, un soutien massif à l'adaptation pour les pays les plus vulnérables et une transformation profonde de nos modes de production, de consommation et de financement. C'est l'occasion de saluer l'adoption par l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies de la résolution sur la décennie mondiale du boisement et du reboisement que mon pays a initiée comme l'une des solutions susceptibles de faire avancer notre combat commun en faveur de la préservation de l'environnement et l'atténuation des ravages liés au changement climatique. Le climat ne doit pas devenir un nouveau facteur de division nord-sud. Il doit être un facteur d'unité mondiale, un motif de solidarité planétaire, le mobile d'une espérance partagée. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs, au moment où les nations du monde sont confrontées à de graves défis, certains de ces défis ayant clairement un retentissement existentiel, voilà que s'enclenche une nouvelle et inquiétante course aux armements. Les dépenses militaires mondiales atteignent aujourd'hui des niveaux records, alors même que des millions d'êtres humains vivent dans l'extrême pauvreté, avec un accès réduit à l'eau potable, à une éducation de qualité et aux soins de santé primaire. Des traités sur le désarmement sont remis en cause, tandis que la prolifération des armes de destruction massive, notamment nucléaires, revient au cœur des préoccupations. Cette dérive est dangereuse à tous égards. Elle ne rend pas notre monde plus sûr, bien au contraire. Elle expose aux périls les plus graves, dont le risque d'une conflagration généralisée qui échapperait à tout contrôle. Fidèle à son engagement en faveur de la paix et de la sécurité internationale, la République du Congo réitère son appel en faveur d'un désarmement mondial. Le moment est venu de nous investir tous dans la recherche de solutions qui renforcent notre sécurité collective, la stabilité et la prospérité de tous les peuples, plutôt que de nourrir le cercle vicieux et destructeur des conflits et de la violence. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs, dans ce monde instable, beaucoup doutent aujourd'hui. Beaucoup s'interrogent. Les Nations unies sont-elles encore utiles? Servent-elles encore à quelque chose? À cela, je voudrais, du haut de cette tribune, répondre clairement oui. Oui, les Nations unies sont même indispensables, mais à une condition, à savoir qu'elles sachent évoluer, qu'elles sachent se réformer, se rapprocher des peuples et répondre concrètement aux défis innombrables des temps présents. Nous ne sommes pas condamnés à la guerre, au repli et à la méfiance. Nous avons encore le choix, celui du courage, de la solidarité et de la responsabilité. Alors, ensemble, unis dans la diversité, faisons vivre les promesses fondatrices de notre organisation, à savoir la paix, la dignité et le progrès. Ne laissons pas l'histoire se faire sans nous. Je vous remercie.
Of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of the Congo. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Kashim Shettima, Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. I request the protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, distinguished delegates. The chaos that shadows our world is a reminder that we cannot afford the luxury of inaction. We will have been consumed by our differences had there been no community such as this to remind us that we are one human family. Even in our darkest hours, we have refused to be broken. This community was born from the ashes of despair, a vehicle for order, and for the shared assurance that we could not afford to falter again. Our belief in this community is not a posture of moral superiority, but an undying faith in the redemption of humanity. It is, therefore, with profound humility that I stand before you today as Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria on behalf of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu to renew this pledge on behalf of my country. Madam President, Nigeria joins the Committee of Nations in congratulating you on your election as the President of the General Assembly for the 80th session, and I assure you of our unalloyed support during your tenure. I commend your predecessor, my brother, His Excellency Philemon Yang, and the Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, for their outstanding stewardship and unifying leadership during these extraordinary times. This anniversary must not be a sentimental retreat into nostalgia. It must be a moment of truth, a pause to measure where we have stumbled and how we might have done better in turning our values into action that meets the demands of today. We are here to deliver a world of peace and development where the respect for human rights is paramount. We must recalibrate the delicate balance between our roles as sovereign governments and our duties as collective partners to renew multilateralism in a world that has evolved far beyond what it was in 1945. The pace of change across borders is a force without pause. It manifests in the tools of technology, in the movements of information and finance, in the corrosive ideologies that preach violence and division, in the gathering storm of the climate emergency, and in the tide of irregular migration. We must own this process of change. When we speak of nuclear disarmament, the proliferation of small weapons, Security Council reform, fair access to trade and finance, and the conflicts and human suffering across the world, we must recognize the truth. These are stains on our collective humanity. For all our careful diplomatic language, the slow pace of progress on these hardy perennials of the UN General Assembly debate has led some to look away from the multilateral model. Some years ago, I noticed a shift at this gathering. Key events were beginning to take place outside this hall, and the most sought-after voices were no longer heads of state. These are indeed troubling times. Nigeria remains firmly convinced of the merits of multilateralism. But to sustain that conviction, we must show that existing structures are not set in stone. We must make real change, change that works, and change that is seen to work. If we fail, the direction of travel is already predictable. We are here to strengthen the prospect for peace, development, and human rights. Madam President, I want to make 4 points today to outline how we can do this. 1, Nigeria must have a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. This should take place. This should take place as part of a wider process of institutional reform. 2, we need urgent action to promote sovereign debt relief and access to trade and financing. 3, countries that host minerals must benefit from those minerals. And 4th, the digital divide must close. As our friend the Secretary General has said, AI must stand for Africa included. On my first point, the United Nations will recover its relevance only when it reflects the world as it is, not as it was. Nigeria's journey tells this story with clarity. When the UN was founded, we were a colony of 20 million people, absent from the tables where decisions about our fate were taken. Today, we are a sovereign nation of 236 million people, projected to be the third most populous country in the world, with one of the youngest and most dynamic populations on earth, a stabilizing force in regional security, and a consistent partner in global peacemaking. Our case for permanent seat at the Security Council is a demand for fairness, for representation, and for reform that restores credibility to the very institution upon which the hope of multilateralism rests. This is why Nigeria stands firmly behind the UN-80 initiative of the UN Secretary General and the resolution adopted by this Assembly on 18 July 2025, a bold step to reform the wider United Nations system for greater relevance, efficiency, and effectiveness in the face of unprecedented financial strain. We support the drive to rationalize structures and end the duplication of responsibilities and programs, so that this institution may speak with one voice and act with greater coherence. Madam President, Africa, none of us in this world can function peacefully in isolation. This is the heavy burden of sovereignty. Sovereignty is a covenant of shared responsibility, a recognition that our survival is bound to the survival of others. To live up to this charge, we must work hand in hand with our neighbors and partners. We must follow the trails of weapons, of money, and of people. For these forces, too often driven by pestilent non-state actors, ignite the fires of conflict across our region. Madam President, Nigeria's soldiers and civilians carry a proud legacy. They have participated in 51 out of 60 United Nations peacekeeping operations since our independence in 1960. We have stood with our partners in Africa to resolve conflicts, and we continue that commitment today through the Multinational Joint Task Force. At home, we confront the scourge of insurgency we resolve. From this long and difficult struggle with violent extremism, one truth stands clear. Military tactics may win battles measured in months and years, but in wars that span generations, it is values and ideas that deliver the ultimate victory. We are despised by terrorists because we choose tolerance over tyranny. Their ambition is to divide us and to poison our humanity with a toxic rhetoric of hate. Our difference is the distance between shadow and light, between despair and hope, between the ruin of anarchy and the promise of order. We do not only fight wars, we pit and shelter the innocent victims of war. This is why we are not indifferent to the devastations of our neighbors near and distant. This is why we speak of the violence and aggression visited upon innocent civilians in Gaza, the illegal attack on Qatar, and the tensions that scar the wider region. It is not only because of the culture of impunity that makes such acts intolerable, but because our own bitter experience has taught us that such violence never ends where it begins. We do not believe that the sanctity of human life should be trapped in the corridors of endless debate. That is why we say, without stuttering and without doubt, that a two-state solution remains the most dignified path to lasting peace for the people of Palestine. For too long, this community has borne the weight of moral conflict. For too long, we have been caught in the crossfire of violence that offends the conscience of humanity. We come not as partisans, but as peacemakers. We come as brothers and sisters of a shared wall, a wall that must never reduce the right to live into the currency of devious politics. The people of Palestine are not collateral damage in a civilization searching for order. They are human beings, equal in worth, entitled to the same freedoms and dignities that the rest of us take for granted. We want to make the choice crystal clear. Civilized values over fear. Civilized values over vengeance. Civilized values over bloodshed. We show the opportunities that peace brings, just as the extremists hope to drive apart rival communities and different religions. We work through multilateral platforms within the rule of law to build the consensus and support that makes this immensely difficult and dangerous task that much easier. This is how we deny our enemies the space they crave to fuel tension and despair. It is our experience that this offers the best, perhaps only hope for peace, reconciliation, and victory for the civilized values of a shared humanity. Nigeria is a diverse country, also recognizes the variable geometry of democracy in different forms and spheres. For this reason, we are working with the United Nations to strengthen democratic institutions in our region and beyond through the Regional Partnership for Democracy. Madam President, point 2. The price of peace is eternal vigilance. The increasingly difficult security outlook has prompted many member states to count the cost of the emerging world order. We in Nigeria are already familiar with so difficult choices: infrastructure renewal or defense platforms, schools or tanks. Our view is that the path to sustainable peace lies in growth and prosperity. The government has taken difficult but necessary steps to restructure our economy and remove distortions, including subsidies and currency controls that benefited the few at the expense of the many. I believe in the power of the market to transform. Our task is to enable and facilitate and to trust in the ingenuity and enterprise of the people. But the process of transition is difficult and brings unavoidable hardship. This year, we held the inaugural West African Economic Summit in Abuja to bring investors and opportunities together. The results far exceeded our expectations and are a clear indication of what innovation can deliver. It is in that same spirit of dynamic review that I invite the United Nations to re-examine the best use of scarce resources. One critical area is climate change. It is not an abstract issue about an indeterminate fate to be settled at some distant point in the future. It is not even solely an environmental issue. It is about national, regional, and international security. It is about irregular migration. Truly, this is an everyone issue. We are all stakeholders, and we are all beneficiaries of the best outcomes. Madam President, this is why relevant ministers have been instructed to work with the UN to make the best use of climate funds. We believe there are huge shared dividends to accrue from increased support for education, for resilient housing, for access to technology and financing to allow vulnerable communities to thrive, to become part of solutions rather than problems. Nigeria and Africa have made significant strides in recent years to put our affairs in order. We can take that progress to the next level, a level that presents new opportunities for trade, investment, and profit, if we can assess reforms to strengthen the international financial architecture. We need urgent action to promote debt relief, not as an act of charity, but as a clear path to the peace and prosperity that benefits us all. I'm calling for new and binding mechanism to manage sovereign debt, a sort of international court of justice for money that will allow emerging economies to escape the economic straitjacket of primary production of unprocessed exports. It has been over 4 decades since the Lagos Plan of Action outlined a route away from debt and dependence that highlighted opportunities that today should still be explored for local added value for processing and manufacturing in everything from agriculture to solid minerals and petrochemicals. The African Continental Free Trade Area is a remarkable achievement of cooperation. We remain fully committed to the achievement of the SDGs and are convinced that this can be best delivered by focusing principally on our primary mission of growth and prosperity. Madam President, on our third point, we welcome steps to move towards peace in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We agree that international investment and engagement offer a way out of the cycle of decay and violence. Access to strategic minerals from Sierra Leone in the 1990s and Sudan today has for too long been a source of conflict rather than prosperity. Africa, and I must include Nigeria, has in abundance the critical minerals that will derive and drive the technologies of the future. Investments in exploration, development and processing of these minerals in Africa will diversify supply to the international market, reduce tensions between major economies, and help shape the architecture for peace and prosperity on a continent that too often in the past has been left behind by the rivalries and competition between different power blocs. We know in Nigeria that we are more stable when those communities that have access to key resources are able to benefit from these resources. This has been our journey in the oil-producing region of the Niger Delta. I believe that will strengthen the international order when those countries that produce strategic minerals benefit fairly from those minerals in terms of investment, partnership, local processing, and jobs. When we export raw materials, as we have been doing, tension, inequality, and instability fester. Madam President, the fourth pillar for change that I am advocating is a dedicated initiative, bringing together researchers, private sector, government, and communities to close the digital divide. As we stand on the threshold of new and dramatic technological change, we are still absorbing the impact of the revolution on information and communication of the past 20 years. We understand better than we did the opportunities technology offers, as well as the safeguards we need to enable growth and mitigate the potential for corruption. Some worry about fake news. Truly, we have plenty of that, with the potential of devastating real-world consequences in countries rich and poor. I am more worried about an emerging generation that grows ever more cynical because it believes nothing and trusts less. As technology shakes up public administration, law, finance, conflict, and so much of the human condition, I'm calling for a new dialogue to ensure we promote the best of the opportunities that are arising and promote the level of access that allows emerging economies more quickly to close a wealth and knowledge gap that is in no one's interest. I join you today to reassert Nigeria's commitment to peace, to development, to unity, to multilateralism, and to the defense of human rights is beyond compromise. For none of us is safe until all of us are safe. The road ahead will not be easy, and we know there are no quick fixes to the trials that test the human spirit. Yet history reminds us that bold action in pursuit of noble ideals has always defined the story of the United Nations. Time and again, we have found the wisdom to balance sovereign rights with collective responsibility. That balance is once again in question. But I believe, quite passionately, that a renewed commitment to multilateralism, not as a slogan, but as an article of faith, remains our surest path forward. Nigeria dedicates itself fully and without reservation to that noble cause. I thank you all for listening.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Vice President of the Federal Republic,